most of them have made today. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 5172 in the name of Richard Lochhead on the annual EU fisheries negotiations. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now, and I call on Richard Lochhead to speak to and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, you've got 14 minutes.
Presiding Officer, last week I delivered a statement on fisheries to this chamber outlining our approach to the crucial end-of-year fisheries negotiations. I am, however, grateful to the Business Bureau for now allowing us more time in scheduling a debate on the same subject this week. I did fleetingly think that colleagues might have been so taken with my eloquence last week they wanted to hear a repeat performance, but I suspect that the reality is that this Parliament, of course, values the crucial significance of fisheries to our country and the importance of debating this subject at such a pivotal moment in the year for Scottish fisheries. Last week, my officials were negotiating for Scotland at EU-Norway talks in Bergen, and I should say that since last week, therefore, there have been some developments, or perhaps I should say some non-developments, because those talks, somewhat unusually, ended without a clear resolution and will recommence in January. This means we will be unable to agree the position on all of our fish stocks at this month's Fisheries Council. So I'm afraid it's more uncertainty for the fleet at this time in terms of the shared stocks with Norway and some other issues, but I think we have the support of the industry in terms of postponing these talks because it may result in a better outcome for the industry, and therefore I understand the relaxed about that postponement. But no one can deny that the Scottish fishing industry has experienced some very challenging times recently. It's had to deal with not only a deeply flawed common fisheries policy, but also with the legal straitjacket of a deeply dysfunctional cod recovery plan. As you know, I believe it's essential that we understand and engage with the concerns of our fishermen. And it's only yesterday I met all our industry leaders at the Fisheries Management and Conservation Group, which brings together government, industry, NGOs and others in a collective forum to oversee the management of Scotland's fisheries. At that meeting we had the extensive discussion about Scotland's priorities for this month's Fisheries Council, which I travel out to on Monday. But the take-home message was the urgent need for radical reform of the cod recovery plan, a regulation which has failed our fish stocks, our wider marine environment and, of course, our fishing communities. Above all others, that's the message I shall take with me when I travel to Brussels on Monday for these vital end-of-year talks. Talks that, for me, will be about putting sustainable fisheries and common sense before the archaic and rigid world of legal technicalities. Lawyer says no is a mantra which I simply will not accept, especially when no means trampling all over our shared objectives for conservation and sustainable fisheries management. Next week, I will also take with me to Brussels the knowledge that the Scottish industry has shown a vigour and resilience which have delivered remarkable achievements in recent years. And the produce our fishermen bring ashore is, of course, second to none. Between 2007 and 2011, our landing values increased in real terms by a fifth, culminating in 359,000 tonnes of seafood landed last year, valued at over £500 million. As I said last week, that's the highest value in real terms this century. And all that delivered at a time when the backdrop has been an unprecedented recession. So that trend reflects rising quotas in many of our key stocks. We've seen increases in recent years in stocks such as West Coast haddock, West Coast nephrops or prawns, North Sea haddock, North Sea whiting and North Sea herring. And as I pointed out last week, the IC's advice for next year points to further increases across many of our most important stocks, up 15% for North Sea haddock, 11% for North Sea whiting, 15% for North Sea saithe, 53% for North Sea megrim, 15% for North Sea herring and 18% for West of Scotland nephrops. Yeah.
Tavish Scott.
Cabinet Secretary, he would presumably share the industry's concern about the number of data-deficient stocks, and while the IC's advice on those stocks that he's mentioned is correct and is helpful, does he have any view as to how to address the data-deficient stocks, which are still a very important part of the catch of the Scottish whitefish industry?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, how we have attempted to address that in recent years is building our scientific knowledge of some of the high-value stocks that are really important to Shetland and some other fisheries, and I believe that's beginning to pay off. We've also had to resist the Commission's attempts in recent years to automatically slash those quotas where there's, in their views, a lack of data, so we've managed to thankfully resist that to an extent in recent years. But once the catch is landed, which I've been referring to, our onshore sector then does a tremendous job in adding value to it. And as Claire Baker's amendment notes, this month's negotiations will also be crucial, of course, for these processing interests as well as for our catching sector. And while our catchers struggle with EU regulation, our onshore interests face new challenges as well, and we shouldn't ignore them as they attempt to successfully market our produce across the world. But they do continue to fly the flag for Scottish caught produce overseas despite tough trading conditions, and are to be commended for maintaining such a strong track record of Scottish exports. So our seafood sector needs our support, and nearer to home I really would urge our colleagues in the Chamber and all fellow Scots to include Scottish caught seafood in their plans for the festive period and to enjoy some of the fine produce harvested from our own pristine waters. And this produce comes from one of the most varied fisheries in Europe. That makes it a fantastically rich asset for Scotland, but it also means that the advice on quotas is very often a mixed bag. While some stocks are up, others point downwards. This year is no exception, and ICES advice is a 20% reduction in North Sea cod, a 48% reduction in West Coast haddock, a 20% reduction in Rockall cod, and a 20% reduction in the west of Scotland in North Sea monkfish, a 21% reduction in North Sea nephrops, and a 40% reduction in west of Scotland megrim. So in addressing some of these issues, our approach will be driven by three well-established principles, which I repeat again, on which we have been consistent over the years. Our approach will be guided by science and stock sustainability. We will support the social and economic well-being of our industry and the communities that depend on that industry. And finally, we will seek to reduce discards in line with our pledge to achieve discard-free fisheries in Scottish waters. These principles are all undermined by a firm belief that conservation and stability of stocks go hand in hand with the long-term well-being of the industry. So we believe these are sensible and laudable aims, if only we could be allowed to go on and deliver them unhindered. Unfortunately, the EU's deeply flawed fisheries regulations continue to thwart us at every turn. Europe's approach to sustainable fisheries should be responsive to the changing biology in our seas, with the flexibility to react sensibly and swiftly to the constantly moving dynamics of our marine ecosystem. Instead, it's bound by constraints of rigid regulations like the Cod Recovery Plan, trapped within unbending rules imposed years ago through political deals. At last year's December Council, we saw the worst of that, and we got a taste of this when we did battle with the Commission's lawyers. We won that battle in favour of conservation measures. Scientists, fishermen and even the Commission all agreed then that the Cod Recovery Plan is flawed, but the Commission stubbornly insists on imposing a rigid requirement for further automatic cuts in days at sea this year. They did at least promise us a review of the plan by spring this year in response to our demands. But again, they didn't deliver any proposals in time, and they didn't deliver these proposals until September. And that delay means that any freeze could not be approved by both the European Parliament and the Council well into next year.
William MacArthur.
I'm very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary for taking intervention. I very much share his frustration in terms of the legal straitjacket he finds himself in. Not only is he armed with the science which he's already identified, but can he perhaps explain to the Chamber some of the support he expects to get from other Member States who clearly must feel many of the same frustrations as he does?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, in terms of some of the measures, in terms of the freeze of effort and indeed cod, which I'll speak about shortly, we expect to have the support of up to 22 Member States on these issues, and I hope that alliance holds together through the whole of next week. And indeed, as Liam MacArthur's colleague Tavish Scott's amendment makes clear, securing an effort freeze this month is key to the continued health of our industry, and it would be deplorable if our fishers were to become collateral damage in any bureaucratic fallout between the EU institutions. Thankfully, as I've just said, that's a view shared by other Member States, and we've been able to develop proposals with the European Presidency, not the Commission, the Presidency, to deliver what everyone agrees is necessary. However, we are now in danger of being embroiled in that dispute between the European Parliament and Council over who has the right to approve vital amendments to fisheries negotiations or regulations. So, Presiding Officer, this is yet another extraordinary example of self-indulgent legal bickering by EU institutions, picking legal fights with each other while our fishers' livelihoods are endangered and an industry's place in the critical list. This squabble is now blocking the passage of crucial technical conservation measures. If EU ministers next week don't defeat the Commission's lawyers in Brussels, then many vessels in our fleet will face economic chaos and our stocks will be damaged in 2013. So I'm calling on all key players in the EU institutions to see sense and work together to ensure these technical conservation measures remain in force next year, and other amendments that are required are delivered.
Dennis
I
Robertson.
think I heard a amendment.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking intervention. He said it will be devastating for our fleet, our vessels, but it would also be extremely devastating for those that are producing the fish it's caught.
Cabinet Secretary.
Dennis Robertson's quite right. Of course, this has huge knock-on impacts for our onshore sector as well. And quite apart from these legal wrangles, we're also contending with rigid rules in the cod recovery plan, which now require a 20% cut in the North Sea cod quota in 2013. Yet, this is a stock which has more than doubled over the past 6 years, a stock which our fishers and our scientists are seeing in ever greater numbers, and a stock which has seen Europe's greatest reduction in cod discards, with rates falling from 43% in 2009 to around 25% last year. Tragically, a 20% cut will undo all that good work and be a recipe for massive discards. Try as they might, our fishers will find it impossible not to catch ever more plentiful cod. They will have to dump all the cod for which they have no quota back into the sea dead. And indeed, our innovative discard-free catch quota scheme could be left with little cod quota to make it viable. That could mean 23 of our biggest whitefish vessels having to start discarding cod again. As I said last week, the cod recovery plan is supposed to promote conservation, but it threatens to leave long and winding trails of discarded fish across Europe's seas. I took the opportunity to speak to our scientists about this again yesterday. They assured me that there is a good scientific case for rolling over the North Sea cod quota, an approach which would avoid an explosion in discards and still achieve a healthy recovery of the stock by the target date of 2015. So the reality is that this cut is not driven by sensible science. It results in an arcane legal rule buried within the plan. On that basis, I will be making a rollover of this year's cod quota another top priority at next week's Council. But beyond December Council, we need to push reform further, demanding more responsive regulations which reward and recognise our fleet's cutting-edge conservation efforts. And Jamie McGregor's amendment quite rightly lauds the enormous and highly creditable conservation efforts made by our fishers in recent years, and the need to promote and encourage those initiatives, not undermine them or allow Brussels lawyers to undermine them. So our North Sea prawn fleet and other fleets have been taking really good steps by adopting new selective gear over the past year, and we should welcome that. And we have to recognise the flexibility we require to achieve at next week's Council. It will be really important for many of our fleets, particularly on the west coast of Scotland, which faces some particular challenges over the next year, and indeed has done in recent months due to the effort problems we've experienced in Scottish waters due to a lack of flexibility within the cod recovery plan. There are many other issues I could speak about, and I'll happily take comments from the floor, which I'll try and respond to in my closing speech. All I can say is we'll continue to keep our eye on all the various important issues that will be discussed at Council next week. There are issues relating to high-value stocks such as megrim and monkfish, as well as some of the other key stocks I've been mentioning in my remarks as well. But it does boil down to the fact that once again next week we'll have to decide on these crucial issues with other exhausted ministers at some ungodly hour of the early morning in Brussels, following hours of rather grubby horse trading. So I really am determined to see decision-making brought closer to home and to do away with this micromanagement from Brussels, which has been so damaging to Scotland, so damaging to fisheries conservation and our fishing communities. And that is why Scotland's been the first country out of the blocks to promote regionalisation. If I have time
in your last minute. I'm afraid you're in your last minute.
Okay. Apologies. So that's why we have to secure the radical reform of European fisheries policy throughout 2013, as that will be negotiated. Let's hope this is the last experience of the broken CFP, which is so damaging to everything we stand for in this Parliament. And, of course, we have other issues to contend with in 2013, such as breaking the deadlock over the mackerel stock, which is Scotland's most valuable stock at the current time, and which has been endangered by irresponsible behaviour by Faroes and Iceland. And in 2013, we'll be thinking out the box about how we can have a game changer in terms of these negotiations. Otherwise, we'll be left without a mackerel stock, left without a mackerel and pelagic sector in Scotland, and thousands of livelihoods will be endangered. So I look forward to the comments of members around the Chamber so we can go to Brussels next week and secure the best possible deal for Scotland.
Many thanks. And I now call on Claire Baker to speak to and move Amendment 5172.2 Ms Baker, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I am pleased we've been able to schedule the debate this week in advance of the Council of Ministers negotiations, and last week's statement was welcome in establishing the key areas of concern. And while in the last few days we have seen some setbacks, particularly in relation to mackerel, today does give us all an opportunity to emphasise our priorities as the Cabinet Secretary heads off to further negotiations. So our fishing sector provides employment, with just under 5,000 fishermen in the catching sector and many more in connected sectors, and our world-class produce carries Scotland's brand across the world. And while it is distinctly Scottish, it is also an industry which operates throughout the UK, whether fleets may choose to land fish in other parts of the UK or where there is a common regulatory system. And while the annual quota negotiations emphasise the difference between countries, differences which were described last year as heated and chaotic, it is also an industry, particularly through the offshore operations and exports, which is dependent on our relationships with Europe. Fishing is a significant industry in Scotland, one which has seen, as the Cabinet Secretary says, real terms growth in landing values over recent years and success in international recognition and quality. But it's also a diverse section which faces many challenges, whether it is the future of our more vulnerable coastal communities or the margins that have been experienced by many in the onshore sector, which is such a key part of a productive fishing industry. And Labour's amendment today recognises that their futures is as dependent on annual negotiations as the fleet's is. I recognise the pressures that are on the sector, the value of increasing stocks is being squeezed by inflexible regulation, and the irresponsible behaviour of other countries is damaging our reputation. But I also recognise the need for sustainable management and international agreement. We can't forget that all this opportunity and wealth comes from a natural resource, our seas, which we exploit, which doesn't always necessarily mean a negative interpretation, but we do exploit a natural resource. And so proper management of our seas and cooperation is essential if we are to leave a legacy for future generations. We have experienced, and in too many parts of the world we are still experiencing, the consequences of overfishing, but we know the success we can achieve with stock recovery through sustainable management. So today we look forward to the EU fishing negotiations, and of course sometimes I think the outcomes might be more positive if they were annual cooperation rather than negotiation, but this is the highly charged atmosphere of the EU, and these annual negotiations are well past their shelf life, and progress must be made on reform of the common fisheries policy so we can move away from this annual horse trading. Last week's statement and members' questions identified the key challenges faced as we go into negotiations. There are some positive outcomes predicted for the sector, a proposed increase for North Sea haddock and whiting and herring, as well as West Scotland nephrops. However, the cod recovery plan, a more than 20% cut to TAC has been proposed, with having an impact on quota, as well as a reduction in days at sea. And cod is one of our most valued fisheries. It's valued at £2.3 million in 2011, and there was no denying the initial need for a cod recovery plan, but there's also no denying that that plan is no longer working and is in need of significant reform. And as the Cabinet Secretary said, in September the European Commission did bring forward proposals for a new plan, and yet we are having to deal with the frustrations of delays to reform, and now the unacceptable situation outlined by the Cabinet Secretary of a dispute between the European Parliament and the Council of Ministers over who can propose and agree amendments which could ease the situation. The inflexibility of the cod recovery plan is damaging to Scottish fishing and is at risk of hindering our conservation measures. We are starting to see a recovery in cod numbers. It is still well below the target biomass levels, but ICES advice does show a slight increase, but we must still be vigilant. I understand that if you want to catch fewer fish, reducing the amount that can be caught seems a sensible move, but with a mixed fisheries in Scotland, this is more likely to lead to increased discards. There should be a sensible response to this, but the plan is so inflexible and unresponsive, it is at risk of causing more problems than it solves. The proposed quota cut will be damaging to Scottish fishing. A mixed fishery will make this impossible to achieve without increasing discards, the issue which we are all actually united in trying to tackle. And as the Cabinet Secretary also outlined, the proposed quota cut and reduced effort could also have a negative impact, perversely, on our conservation credits, a successful scheme which rewards conservation measures, and also the cod catch quota scheme, which Alex Ferguson raised in the statement last week, which concentrates on reducing discards. And a cut to effort will make it difficult to offer the additional days at sea as an incentive, potentially limiting the number who could actually take advantage of this successful scheme. So the future of the cod catch quota is also at risk if quota is reduced. So in Scotland we've shown that there are innovative approaches to modern management of fisheries, and WWF and RSPB in a briefing for today's debate are right to call on MSPs to call on the Scottish Government to ensure that if there is a rollover of this year's cod quota, additional measures must be taken to ensure cod mortality continues to decrease. And as I've said, we're only seeing a slight increase in the biomass level of cod, and so there's still much progress to be made. And if we are to see a freezing of the quota, this must be concurrent with participative and adaptive management. It will be hugely disappointing if a cod quota reduction limits our ability to deliver on conservation measures. So there needs to be investment in finding solutions and innovative ways of working that will support a sustainable industry. And that's why this year I was pleased to recognise the work of Dan Watson, a recent graduate of Glasgow School of Art, who won the UK James Dyson Award and then went on to win the International Award, beating finalists from over 17 countries with his safety net system. And escape rings are fitted to the cod end of existing nets, and the rings light up as an emergency exit for smaller fish, which is quite an intriguing image. But it's encouraging to see it, in graduates, this level of interest and innovation. But to go to the next level with this model or other innovations, there must be investment in science and manufacturing, both from the public and the private sector, if we are to deliver sustainable fishing methods which can not only be applied in this country, but can be used to tackle some of the significant challenges we see around the world. Labour's amendment today also raises the issue of the mackerel dispute. And it was disappointing that last week we saw the second round of fishing talks between the EU and Norway concluding without agreement. And while this has an impact on North Sea cod and herring, it has serious consequences for mackerel. The ongoing dispute with Iceland and Faroe Islands has led to Scottish mackerel having its MSC certificate suspended and proposals for a quota cut to compensate for overfishing. This is a desperate situation, but it's not one of Scottish fleet's own making. We've always taken the position, both within Labour Party and I think within the Parliament, that we should be guided by the science, which is calling for a quota cut. But this would be hugely unfair to Scottish fleets that are being affected by the irresponsible behaviour of other countries. So sanctions must be the last resort, and we call on the reconvened talks to bring some sense to the situation, but I do appreciate how difficult this is. There is a suggestion that a quota cut will be the condition of introducing sanctions, and I welcomed the Cabinet Secretary's comments last week that this wouldn't be acceptable. But the impasse needs to be broken, and those who recognise the unfairness of the situation must present a united case. If it comes to sanctions, there will be unintended consequences for other sections of the sector. And I noted that in the Westminster Hall debate earlier this week, Angus MacNeill MP raised issues around if there is to be sanctions, this could have an impact on the cost for consumers. So it's not a risk-free solution, but this is why it's all the more reason to reach a resolution through negotiation. And this must be clear that this is to the benefit of all partners. Finally, Labour's amendment today also calls on the Scottish Government to announce the full operational details of the Concordat on fisheries management between the UK administrations that will come into effect in 2013. Announced last December, the Concordat will come into operation next year, and quota allocations to the 4 UK countries will replace the present system, where the UK Government allocates quota directly to fishermen and to producer organisations. I understand it also seeks to rationalise arrangements for the licensing and administration of fishing vessels. So last year, the Concordat was presented as a framework for the 4 UK fisheries administrations to be given a greater degree of control over the management of their own commercial fishing fleets within a UK-wide quota and effort management and licensing system, and that's quoting from the Concordat. I have managed to get a copy of the letter sent by the Cabinet Secretary to the members of the Fisheries Management and Conservation Group in May, which recognised that some issues of detail remain to be settled in relation to allocation. Last week, the Welsh Minister provided a written statement with an update on the management of fisheries, which described the discussions over the Concordat as arduous. It is important that Parliament is informed of these changes and that they carry the confidence of the sector, and I would appreciate further information from the Cabinet Secretary. Presiding Officer, there are many challenges ahead for the Scottish fishing fleets, but there are also many opportunities, and I am proud that we have a fishing sector which is working towards sustainable fishing and is prepared to take an international lead in securing we can leave a positive legacy for future generations. And I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. I now call on Jamie McGregor to speak to and move amendment point 3.
And I'm delighted that the Scottish Government and party business managers retrieved this debate after it was displaced by the debate on Leveson. I actually found the report, the statement given by the Cabinet Secretary, very helpful, so perhaps it was a blessing in disguise. It's right that we have the annual debate, as the outcome of each December's EU fisheries negotiations remains absolutely vital for the people of Scotland's fishing communities and the jobs and livelihoods which depend on them. Many of these are on the edge of the North Sea coast and also in the remote rural and island communities in the Highlands and Islands. And in terms of this year's proposals, we agree with the Scottish Government that the suggested 20% reduction in North Sea cod is not acceptable. Scientific evidence shows the North Sea cod stock is recovering well, and the biomass of the stock has doubled in the past 5 years. A further 20% reduction in catching opportunity would lead inevitably to a significant increase in discards, which is something that everybody is trying to avoid, and it would risk also destroying the almost discard-free catch quota scheme, which is producing positive results. The Scottish fleet has shown itself to be one of the most responsible in Europe. Since I've been in this Parliament, they've done masses of work on enlarging the mesh size of the nets, experimenting with different types of cod end in the trawl nets. They have installed escape panels in the nets. All of these measures have helped with minimising discards and the cod recovery plan. And these are all measures which prevent them catching fish. So I would put it to you that this is a real sacrifice in the name of conservation. Video cameras have been installed in some instances to make sure that there is evidence of the right things happening. How many other European fleets have done as much as our Scottish fleet in the name of conservation? A rollover of this year's total allowable cod catch is vital, and it will allow the stock to continue to recover sustainably with continued and realistic progress on discard reduction. Now, we welcome the increase in quota for some key North Sea stocks, such as haddock, but we have real concerns about the reductions faced by some important stocks on the West Coast, including megrim, monkfish, whiting and hake, and about the recommendation for zero TAC of rockall haddock. For those skippers who have traditionally fished the West Coast whitefish stocks from Oban, Malay, Lochindra, Kinlochbervie and Scrabster, and their numbers are drastically decreased compared to even with 10 years ago, these proposals fly in the face of their practical experience, which is that the stocks of these species are in better shape now than for 10 years. But given the efforts of the Scottish fleets have made in conservation over the last decade, which are amongst the very best in Europe, and the severe overall reduction in boat numbers and effort for those fishermen that are left, we cannot afford to see yet more cuts in TACs year on year. Total fishing effort in kilowatt days by Scottish whitefish vessels fell by more than two-thirds, 69%, between 2001 and 2011. The EU fisheries deal must ensure a sustainable fishing industry as well as sustainable stocks for those boats that are left, and this is the purpose of my amendment. And I want to make some points on behalf of my West Coast prawn fishermen constituents, further to my questioning of the Cabinet Secretary last week during his statement. They faced the possible closure of the West Coast prawn fishery for 6 weeks, from the 21st of December. Now, thankfully, it looks like, at the last minute, a compromise deal has been reached, which will avoid this crisis, but will completely close the fishery for 2 weeks, from December the 21st to the 7th of January, and then will only allow fishing 4 days a week. So they are being done out of a lot of effort through no fault of their own. The Cabinet Secretary said last week that not even he could have predicted the lack of prawns in the North Sea this year, which caused East Coast vessels to migrate to the West Coast prawn fishing grounds. But the point is that the West Coast prawn fishermen and their representatives have been warning him and Marine Scotland about the impact this was having since May, And in the nicest possible way, I ask, why has it taken so long to settle what should not have been a difficult issue to protect the artisanal fleet? And why should they have to put up with a compromise when I'm led to believe that the Cabinet Secretary previously assured them that if vessels had quota remaining, he would ensure they had days at sea to catch it? Can he now give a guarantee that this problem will not be repeated next year? West Coast fishermen and the fish processors, which depend on their catch, deserve better than a compromise. And I will close by referring to the current CFP reform proposals. What can the Cabinet Secretary do to ensure that the where possible proviso in relation to maximum sustainable yield is reinserted in the plan? Scotland's mixed fishery means that it is simply not possible to achieve a maximum sustainable yield for all stocks at all times, and the Cabinet Secretary must make the EU recognise this reality. On discards, how can ministers persuade their EU colleagues that this is a complex issue and ensure that the regulation achieved is practical and deliverable? And shouldn't the real focus be on ensuring that fishing mortality is at sustainable levels? My colleague Alex Ferguson will talk about the catch quota scheme and its success in reducing discards, but it must be borne in mind that it is only 26 boats in the demersal fleet that are involved in what is a pilot scheme, and this has already had the unintended consequence of putting up the price of leasing quota for other boats and vessels. I'm just finishing. Can he tell us how the pilot scheme will become an overall scheme? We wish the Cabinet Secretary every success, and I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. I now call on Tavish Scott to speak to and move Amendment 5172.1. Mr Scott, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. John William Simpson tweeted me last night, that is the way of the modern Shetland fisherman. He'd landed 450 boxes on the Lerwick market yesterday and grossed £29,000. He said, "We certainly can't land our expensive quota allocation and keep a viable business going in this climate." I'm sure that's a comment that many of my colleagues from across the chamber would recognise from their own areas. And that is indeed my main point in this very welcome parliamentary debate on fisheries, that our whitefish fleet doesn't have the time at sea to catch the amount of fish they are or were allocated in 2012. Yet the European Commission want to make that position worse, as the Cabinet Secretary rightly pointed out. The Commission want a further 18% cut in days at sea in the North Sea. Some whitefish vessels only had 90 days at sea this year. 90 less 18% is only 74. No business I know can survive by operating on only 74 days out of 365. The industry is at a tipping point. If the December Fisheries Council agrees this cut, the financial consequences for Scottish fishing vessels are simply enormous. The Cabinet Secretary was right in pointing out that the EU-Norway fisheries negotiations in Bergen last week broke up without agreement on either mackerel, herring, cod or, crucially, effort in the North Sea. Those talks are due to reconvene in January, but we should ask ourselves why those talks collapsed, in my understanding, for the first time in modern times. They collapsed because the European Commission are in a legal hole entirely of their own making. The cod recovery plan commits to cut upon cut in effort in days our boats can fish. Commissioner Damanaki promised after last year's Council that would be sorted out during 2012. Now, the Shetland Fishermen's Association, the Scottish Fishermen's Federation and many more have lobbied the Scottish Government throughout this year for that fix. It hasn't happened, and fishermen wonder why a promise given by a Fisheries Commissioner at a European Council meeting in December simply hasn't come to pass. So now the European Commission, the Council of Ministers and the European Parliament are in a legal dispute over who makes decisions. Fishermen don't care, I certainly don't care, and I rather suspect the Fisheries Secretary doesn't care either. What we do care about is the need for the European Union Presidency compromise that removes Articles 9 and 12 from the cod recovery plan. That would allow the rollover on days and agreement to be reached on cod quota in the North Sea. Leslie Tate, the chairman of the Shetland Fishermen's Association, who met the Cabinet Secretary yesterday, tells me that the intelligence on other member states is that they do support this position. But fishermen know, the Cabinet Secretary absolutely knows, that support now is one thing, but when the European Commission tried to buy off a member with, as he put it, a grubby little compromise at 4 in the morning during next week, anything can happen. And were we to lose one member state from this particular arrangement, then the deal would be lost. There needs to be unanimity, as I understand it. I'd be happy to be corrected, but there needs to be unanimity on this before the legal change can be overcome. This is, in short, an internal EU institutional arm wrestle. It must not be allowed to destroy an industry. The lawyers must not be allowed to win. After all, when the Germans need the European Union to rip up European law to save the Eurozone, no lawyer stands in the way of that. So what's surely good enough for the Eurozone should certainly be good enough for the Cod Recovery Plan as well. The European lunatics should not be allowed to take over the Brussels asylum. The European Commission still want further conservation methods to save the cod. I think this shows a grotesque lack of awareness of how strong cod stocks are across the entire North Sea, and as we know, fisheries science can lag 2 years behind the reality of what is actually happening. Our boats have obeyed cod avoidance areas where no fishing takes place, except fishing, of course, does take place in those areas. French, English, Spanish and Norwegian gill netters fish in areas closed by Scottish Government as a conservation measure. Surely a closed area, Presiding Officer, should mean exactly that. It is closed. So I suggest to our Minister that if the environmentalists and the scientists want closed areas, then agree, but on the simple condition that they're closed for all boats, not just Scottish or Shetland whitefish vessels, but for all boats. Can I conclude on mackerel? My understanding of the EU-Norway arrangements is that, again, the European Commission are reneging on the agreement on sanctions that should be imposed on Faroe and Iceland for illegal fishing. The European Commission is now saying that there could be a 25% of the international mackerel quota left unallocated for now, in other words, there to be traded in the future. Well, as Stuart Stevenson, who represents a pelagic port like me, might observe, that's equivalent to running up the white flag on the flagpole. There would be dancing in the streets of Tórshavn and Reykjavik were that to happen. Illegal fishing would have won. I expect our Cabinet Secretary and the UK Government, who have rightly been on the right side on this, to keep it that way and to make sure that no such arrangement is allowed to happen. I very much support the tenor of the remarks made by the Cabinet Secretary, very much support the amendments made by Claire Baker and Jamie McGrigor as well. I thought I'd always bow to Jamie McGrigor's knowledge on prawns, and I look forward to this debate, making sure that the Minister has a very clear understanding of the strength of feeling that we all share about the future of the industry at this crucial time.
Many thanks. We now move to open debate, and I'd ask members to stick to 6 minutes, including interventions, please, as we're tight for time. Angus MacDonald, 6 minutes, to be followed by Graham Day.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's probably fair to say fisheries negotiations give us all that déjà vu feeling more often than any other type of negotiation, as the annual horse trading takes place every December. As a relative newcomer to the Chamber, I have for years watched the negotiations from a distance. However, now at close hand, they seem even more convoluted than they were when I viewed proceedings as an outsider. For example, and I mentioned this in my question during last week's ministerial statement, we have the ludicrous situation with Compromise Amendment 15, which is now, I believe, Compromise Amendment 21, as proposed by Ulrike Rodust, the German Social Democrat rapporteur, which would require Member States to close 10 to 20% of their territorial waters to all fishing activities for at least 5 years. Now, apart from being totally off the wall, such a proposal, were it to go ahead, clearly goes against the decentralisation and regionalisation agenda. It would have a devastating effect on Scottish coastal communities and in particular on small-scale boats, and harbours within those areas would effectively cease to function. The Rodust Amendment mentions territorial waters which are defined in UN law as those within 12 nautical miles of the coast, though the text of this amendment is so ambiguous it could technically mean out to the 200-mile limit. So I was pleased to hear both Struan Stevenson MEP and Ian Hudson MEP agree that this amendment should be thrown out when we discussed the issue at Rural Affairs Committee a few weeks ago. However, it's absolutely imperative that pressure is put on all Scottish and UK MEPs to reject this proposal when the committee vote takes place, which I think is on the 18th of December. One very welcome development from the negotiations is the move towards regionalisation.
As far as possible, decisions relating to the means of achieving the goals set by long-term management plans should be taken at an appropriate regional level, involving those in the fisheries concerned, scientists and other stakeholders, resulting in the maximum degree of regionalisation. Unfortunately, as it stands, at the moment the proposed compromise from the European Parliament still has too much detail decided in Brussels. It is encouraging, however, that throughout the discussions on CFP reform, Scotland has played a leading role in developing solutions and building alliances to shape and reform of the CFP as we would wish to see it. Indeed, Scotland, with one of the most significant fisheries resources in Europe, is ready not just to have a seat at the negotiations, but to take its turn in leading the negotiations. It makes absolute sense to me that the nation with the most vested interest in sustaining fishing stocks, with Scottish vessels landing 84% of the total value of UK landings of key stocks, and with the Scottish fishing zone making up 60% of UK waters, and also with the numbers of fishermen employed on Scottish boats currently sitting at 5,000, and with landings valued at just over £500 million last year, we should be leading on the negotiations. Now, Presiding Officer, if I could turn to discards. In the north east of Scotland, fishermen have endured swings and cuts over the past 20 years. Two-thirds of whitefish have been scrapped. The cod quota is a fifth of what it was in the mid-90s, yet attempts are made by Brussels year after year to introduce further restrictions. The stocks are good, but the quotas are low, and this is the cause of unnecessary discarding. There should be no doubt in anybody's mind that discarding dead or dying fish is a waste of biological and economic resource, never mind being just plain crazy. Within Scotland, with the help of the industry, significant progress has been made in eliminating discards, although there is still some progress to be made if we are to have discard-free fisheries. We have shown in Scotland, however, that the conservation credits scheme is working. For example, Scottish discards of North Sea cod have reduced overall by nearly half since 2007, from 6,500 tonnes to 3,500 tonnes. Much of the discarding is of fish below minimum landing size, so hopefully these can be increasingly avoided with the use of highly selective gears, further reducing the amount of overall fish discarded. We already have other discard reduction measures in place in Scotland, including more selective fishing nets to avoid catching unwanted fish in the first place, and observing seasonal or temporary closures of rich fishing grounds during critical times, amongst others. So while discards are high on the agenda in Brussels, we have already been doing our bit to ensure a workable and enforceable discard policy that is designed in collaboration with Scottish stakeholders. However, we must ensure that a ban on discards does not end up penalising our fleet in other ways. Members will be aware that another major issue in the negotiations is the cod recovery plan. It is imperative that there is a freeze on further reductions of effort under the cod plan. Member States across the EU have made it clear to the European Commission that the flawed cod recovery plan must be replaced and that there must be no more cuts in days at sea in 2013. Again, Presiding Officer, each and every one of us must lobby our respective MEPs to ensure that there are no more cuts in days at sea in 2013. And can I make a specific plea to the Liberal Democrat Group to highlight this to their sole MEP on the Fisheries Committee, Chris Davis, who has made statements against the industry in the past and has made calls to halt the industry and put fleets to the side. We see cod recovering, with international scientists commending Scotland's approach to cod recovery, with North Sea stock up 150% since 2006, and a stock for Scottish fishermen have delivered Europe's greatest reduction in cod discards, with rates plummeting from 43% in 2009 to 25% in 2011, as the Cabinet Secretary has already mentioned. So as if our fishing industry hasn't had to endure enough over the years, it is now faced with a 20% cut in the North Sea cod quota for 2013, which, it should be plain for all to see, will result in massive discards, as our fishermen will not be able to avoid catching ever more plentiful cod. To reiterate, Presiding Officer, it is imperative that each and every one of us in this chamber lobby our own MEPs to reject the bad compromises tabled in Brussels for the sake of our £500 million industry in Scotland.
Many thanks. Now call on Graham Day, to be followed by Margaret McDougall. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The importance of fishing to Scotland and our coastal communities cannot be overstated. In spite of the well-documented downsizing of the industry over a number of years, as of the beginning of 2012, there are still almost 2,100 vessels operating and nearly 5,000 fishermen employed within it. There are 18 travel-to-work areas where more than 2% of the population is employed in the sector, Compare that to just 3 in England and 1 in Northern Ireland. So fishing still very much matters to our country. And those who make their living from it continue to dread this time of year and the crucial negotiations which will determine the level of opportunity they'll have in 2013 to make that living. The bare figures suggest that fishing remains a Scottish success story, with a near 20% increase in real-term landings recorded between 2007 and 2011. Yet the industry has faced tremendous challenges during that period, and anecdotally is finding it harder to attract new entrants. That was certainly the message I received from skippers and processors alike when I met with them at Peterhead Fish Market during the summer. They told me that young folk weren't going to sea or becoming involved in this vitally important processing sector in the way they had previously, because neither occupation was viewed as offering a secure and profitable future. I actually don't have to look far from my own family circle for proof of that. 3 generations of my wife's family were involved in the industry on the Buchan coast. Her brother, the last of these, has, like so many fishermen, now turned to the oil industry to make his living. And it was quite depressing in Peterhead to meet a gentleman who had, he told me, owned the largest beam trawler in Scotland, which has now been stripped of its fishing gear and being put to use sailing out into the North Sea to anchor in proximity to oil rigs in order to keep fishing boats away from the installations. Presiding Officer, this industry really could do with some Christmas cheer from next week's negotiations and some sign of hope from the haggling going on around the reform of the Common Fisheries Policy. As the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned, the science provided by the International Council for the Exploration of the Sea suggests quota increases of between 11 to 15% for North Sea haddock, whiting and saithe, for example, would be in order. However, the same source is pointing towards a 20% reduction in North Sea and Rockall cod and a 48% cut in West Coast haddock. In his speech to Parliament last week, the Cabinet Secretary suggested he would have his work cut out fighting Scotland's position on this. That may prove something of an understatement given the lessons of history. Of course, at the heart of the problem, as we've heard, lies the inflexible cod recovery plan. We're told that, on the one hand, over the past 6 years, the stock has doubled in size. We also know that Scottish boats have reduced the level of cod discards by over half in the past 5 years. Yet, under the cod recovery plan, as we've heard, a 20% cut in North Sea catch is being proposed for 2013, with all the discard implications that will have. It is to be hoped that common sense prevails in the negotiations, and the contribution made to the recovery in numbers by the trailblazing conservation measures adopted by Scots fishermen is rewarded by a reductions freeze and a rollover of this year's quota. This isn't only about following the science, it is also about natural justice. Presiding Officer, the matters being discussed today are of a nature that this Parliament can speak with one voice on, and it's imperative that Scotland's representatives in Brussels do the same as we seek to reform the Common Fisheries Policy. It was clear from the video link evidence session held a few weeks ago by the Rural Affairs Committee, which Angus MacDonald referred to, that the 2 participating European Parliament members, Stuart Stevenson and Ian Hudson, are pretty much on the same page. The participating members were agreed on the need for meaningful regionalisation and delivering reform within a reasonable timetable. Stuart Stevenson described proposals to close 15 to 20% of Member States' territorial waters as terrifying. Ian Hudson used the word ludicrous. They were also pretty much agreed on achieving a combination of sensible rules and targets for the elimination of discards. The impression was absolutely given that Scotland's 2 members of the Fisheries Committee will be speaking up for Scotland's needs. However, given the nature of the all-round decision-making process, with next week's committee vote being followed by plenary consideration in February or March, we need to make sure that all of our MEPs are actively doing this. And the role that the 2 Scots Labour MEPs can play in helping secure a CFP appropriate to Scotland's needs could be significant. Labour, of course, are within the same socialist grouping in the Parliament as Ulrike Rodust. And within that setting, Scots voices need to be heard, garnering support for Scotland's interests and countering some of the rapporteur's less palatable suggestions for future policy. Presiding Officer, I say that not to make a party political point, as I have no reason to doubt that they'll be doing this, but simply to emphasise the need for Scotland's MEPs, like its MSPs, to be speaking with one voice in support of one of our most important industries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Margaret McDougall to be followed by Roderick Campbell. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Firstly, I'd like to pay tribute to all the fishermen who go to sea and risk their lives to bring us high-quality fresh fish every day, and we should be doing all we can to protect their livelihoods. With regard to the EU fisheries negotiations, I now have some understanding of how difficult these negotiations can be, and that the outcome is vitally important to our fisheries industry and all the associated businesses and communities on land. So it is essential that we get the best possible deal for Scotland. As has already been said, the main issues of concern that I can see for the Scottish Government is the mackerel dispute, which has been a long-running problem, and the reduction in quotas of total allowable catch for cod. Everyone is aware of the mackerel dispute, whereby overfishing of mackerel stock by Iceland and the Faroes has led to a proposed decrease in the total allowable catch for Scottish fishermen. Through irresponsible and unsustainable fishing methods, these two countries have led the International Council for the Exploration of the Seas to suggest a 15% reduction in the total allowable catch for mackerel. As it stands, mackerel is Scotland's most profitable fish, and in 2011 we valued it at £164 million to the Scottish economy. This far exceeds the value of any other type of fish. So any cut in the allowable catch would have a negative effect not only on the Scottish fishing economy, but the overall economy of Scotland too. The fact is, this isn't a problem caused by Scotland, yet we are suffering because of the actions of other countries, and this is not acceptable. Negotiators need to engage with both Iceland and the Faroes and come up with a solution to the mackerel dispute, because if both these countries continue to overfish the mackerel stock, it will result in serious problems for the long-term sustainability of our fishing fleets. While I note the proposed sanctions, I hope that they will not be needed and that they shall encourage negotiations whereby all countries involved can sign up to a deal. I know this has been a long-running problem, and I hope this time around they can come up with a solution which all parties will be able to agree to and maintain. As highlighted in the ministerial statement last week, the proposed 20% cut to the total allowable catch for cod will not only affect fishermen's livelihoods, but it is counterproductive because of the likely increase in discards. The cod population is increasing thanks to good fisheries management, so cutting the total allowable catch will mean more cod will be discarded, and everyone agrees discards are wasteful and uneconomic. In his statement last week, the Cabinet Secretary said, and I quote, "Imposing a 20% quota cut is simply a recipe for massive discards. Our fishers won't be able to avoid catching ever more plentiful cod, for which they have no quota, and will be forced against their will to dump dead fish back in the sea." And we on the Labour benches agree that we cannot achieve a long-term sustainable future for the marine environment, the species within it and the people who depend on those species if the practice of discards continues. How can we be expected to meet a full discard ban on cod by 2018 if the total allowable catch is being cut by 20%? Many fish species tend to swim together, and it's very difficult to only catch one type of fish. So I hope this planned reduction can be reconsidered. Finally, we need to push for decentralisation decision-making, giving a degree of flexibility to make it work effectively. If the policy is devolved, that would allow coastal states to develop their own solutions to issues while allowing key stakeholders and those with local expertise to come to the forefront to manage their own fishing industry effectively and sustainably. Keeping in mind the fact that fish do not recognise borders, I think we all agree that decentralised decision-making and the process of regionalisation within fishing policy is the way forward. It is clear to me that one-size-fits-nobody policy has damaged our fisheries industries and fishermen's livelihoods by failing to work in EU markets. It has also damaged our environment by failing to create sustainable fisheries, leading to high levels of overfishing and high levels of discards. While we all understand the need for centralised targets and quotas to protect our fish stocks, we can't assume what works in one EU state would work for all countries. There are times countries need to work together towards a common goal such as the mackerel dispute, but it is recognised that there must be a level of flexibility to allow those with local knowledge to make their own decisions as long as it promotes sustainability. I close with a quote from the Scottish Fishermen's Federation on their concerns, and I quote, "There is a pile of priorities that need to be addressed urgently. The number of days that vessels can put to sea, sanctions for Iceland and Faroes for overfishing mackerel, and a common-sense approach to discarding." I am pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary recognises these all need to be addressed as a matter of urgency, as the power struggle between the various European institutions over who has supremacy in making decisions on fishery management is damaging to the long-term future of our fishing industry.
Thanks very much. Now call on Roderick Campbell to be followed by Stuart Stevenson. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I missed the Cabinet Secretary's statement last week, but at that time I think we were all consumed by the Leveson saga. And I'm grateful, however, to the Business Bureau for allowing time for a full debate today. Hopefully, this report of this debate will not become the chip paper beloved of Jamie McGrigor. Hopefully, anyway, reform of the CFP must remain a priority. We are once again at an important time in the negotiation timetable, and the Cabinet Secretary rightly referred last week to an increase in the value of landings by nearly a fifth over the last 4 years, at a time of recession. But it must be said that this is in the context of a proposed significant reduction in both North Sea cod and West Coast haddock quota, and in particular, in the context of a reduction in the number of fishermen employed in Scotland in Scottish-based vessels to less than 5,000 vessels last year, down more than 200 in a year. And for the fishermen of the East Coast in particular, in Fife, in my constituency, while last year was an improving one for shellfish landings after the poor results in 2010, my understanding is that things are very much worse this year, even allowing for the North Sea prawn fleet a success in adopting gears that ensure unwanted catches are kept to a minimum. The basic position is that there is a shortage of prawns in the North Sea at the present time, and that's a difficulty for the industry in Fife, at a time when, disappointingly, no progress has been made in reopening a previously viable winter sprat fishery in the Firth of Forth. But that's only a small part of Scotland's fishings. Yes, by all means.
Hans Malik.
Thank you very much. I think, considering that the Scottish fisher fleet has made the biggest sacrifice in Europe in terms of giving way to European legislation, perhaps if the European Union wishes to compound the situation by freezing our stock limits, maybe they would want to invest so that we can have inward fish farms to compensate us for that, so that we'll be looking for an investment from them to compensate our fishing industry.
Roderick Campbell.
The member makes a very good point, and I take that one on board. But if I could move now to cod recovery, we know, of course, that a further 20% cut in the cod quota is required in 2013, despite the sterling efforts of Scottish fishermen in assisting the recovery of the fish and the positive way they've approached discards. Whilst it's obviously good news that the cod recovery plan is under review, it's not helpful or indeed sensible that a dispute over whether the plans need to be agreed by the European Parliament as well as the Council of Ministers has occurred. This does need to be sorted out, and we are right to oppose effort cuts, particularly if the impact of these is to detract from the attraction of the Scottish Government's Conservation Credit Scheme. I'm grateful for the resolute stand for common sense that the Cabinet Secretary and his officials have made in Europe in this regard. We all know that automatic cuts to days at sea are deeply flawed on scientific and fishery grounds. Indeed, as Tavish Scott seemed to imply last week, the science points to increase in cod stocks. The point is reinforced again today. The fact is that the management framework provided by the existing CFP has failed, and discards is an indicator of its shortcomings. The Scottish Government is right to commit to achieving discard-free fisheries and to pursue their innovative discard-free catch quota scheme. And we should support European Commission proposals to ban discards altogether by 2016, if not earlier. The CFP is certainly too removed from the communities it impinges upon. We are right to continue to press the case for regionalisation and away from a Brussels-based micromanagement. Fishing communities need to be given responsibility for their local resources, and I agree with those who believe that this should be bottom-up rather than top-down. Trading fishing quotas on an international market would only make bad management worse, and I'm glad to see the Scottish Government will continue to oppose those who, in effect, seek the privatisation of the fishing industry. So let's say no to those who favour such a trade, and as the Scottish Government suggests, the socio-economic well-being of fishing communities must remain a high priority in the negotiations. For the future, Commission proposals for the new CFP to achieve maximum sustainable yield by 2015 are a laudable aim, even with the caveat suggested by Jamie McGregor. As for the mackerel dispute, we must all hope that progress can be made in this dispute between the EU and Norway on the one hand and the Faroes and Iceland on the other. It simply cannot be right to allow a total catch to exceed the scientific advice by more than 40% and to threaten the sustainability of the stock. Given that the UK has the largest share of the mackerel quota of any EU member state, mainly fished by Scottish boats, we should not sit on the sidelines if agreement cannot be reached. We should press the European Commission to implement their proposals on sanctions with a view to bringing the unacceptable practice adopted by industries in Iceland and the Faroe Islands to an end, although I accept Claire Baker's points in that connection. The Scottish Government is clearly working extremely hard to protect the interests of the Scottish fleet and to protect our natural stocks, and to negotiate with neighbours to achieve a genuinely sustainable agreement for all those who fish the seas of Northern Europe. However, it's clear that you can only have so much clout if you do not have the full representation of a member state. I would urge everyone in the Chamber to reflect on the probability that both Scotland and the rest of the UK would benefit from Scotland being an independent member state in negotiations. Clearly, the new CFP is unlikely to predate the referendum, but can we not imagine that working as two individual states within the EU might be to the benefit of both Scotland and the rest of the UK? Indeed, what's absolutely certain is that with 60% of the UK fishing zone and 70% of key stocks held by Scottish producer organisations, no one should doubt the importance of fishing to the Scottish economy. So good luck to both the Cabinet Secretary and to the UK Ministers in the negotiations ahead. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now calling Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Rhoda Grant. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. When I rose to my feet to speak on the 14th of June 2001 at 11 minutes past 4, it was my second day in this Parliament and the subject was the CFP. I'm now speaking in my 442nd speech in Parliament, and yet so much remains the same. Jimmy McGregor and Tavish Scott spoke on that day. Absent are the late Margaret Ewing and Ross Finney and Rona Brankin, who were ministers. The motion that day was moved by the convener of the European Committee, Hugh Henry, and Richard Lochhead was the first member to speak after Mr Henry. Plus ça change, plus la même chose, or as Angus MacDonald said, déjà vu. In 2001, I referred to Alan McCartney, who for some years prior to that had been an active proponent of regional management, of locality management of our natural fishing stock. It's good news that that is now essentially, I think, an orthodoxy in the debate. I think that's very much to be welcomed. On that day, Jamie McGregor then spoke of more local control. So I think very much the kind of consensus that actually we're seeing in this debate today, we could see the beginnings of it then. It certainly is something that I would welcome. I did on that day, of course, refer not only to the economic issues that are around fishing, but to the very human issues that there are in participating in what is the most dangerous industry in these islands. Both Tavish and I, who have probably the most substantial fishing interests in our respective constituencies, have too often had to engage with the consequences of that. The Cabinet Secretary in his remarks spoke of legal bickering. Well, that's nothing new. When I first visited fisheries negotiations at the end of 2002, it was Franz Fischler who was the Commissioner. I see nodding heads, some of us remember. A small country's Commissioner, but from a country with no coast, no fishermen, absolutely nothing at stake. He was, of course, an Austrian. And the person that the Cabinet Secretary and I met that day was Marja Kirshner, who was then the Shadow Fishing Minister's assistant, and yes, she was a lawyer. So the lawyers have been around this issue for some considerable time, and to no great benefit to anybody, apart perhaps from the funding receipts of lawyers. A year later, in an article for my local paper, I wrote of Tavish Scott's difficulties as a minister, with the executive dithering on the subject hanging over him, but his colleague in Westminster, Alistair Carmichael, described the 2003 deal as bad, corrupt and downright deceitful. See, nothing changes whatsoever. In 2008, Alistair Carmichael hasn't changed either, I'm hearing. In 2004, we started to see the real effects of the cuts in our fishing fleet, onshore as well as offshore. We saw, of course, the painters round the harbours, fewer boats to paint, closing. We even saw butchers' shops closing because they were the main source of food supplies for the fishing fleet. 2006, Jim Wallace, who's now out of ministerial office, reminded us of a speech that he made to Westminster in 1988. He referred to drastic cuts in total allowable catches, particularly for cod and haddock. So it's not been the lawyers who've been helping, but it has been our fishermen who've been rising to the challenge. They've designed new nets, highly and very successfully discriminating in the species that they catch. Our fishermen are hugely more effective as conservationists than a single lawyer in an office anywhere in the EU. The right to catch has to be viewed as a basic human right, not a right for sale, but one held in trust for future generations of our fishermen. It Garza's grew, and it's been referred to, that we see Spaniards fishing in some of the deep holes off Peterhead that are banned to our fishermen for good conservation reasons. They're going on there, and a single haul of net can lift several years of future catch that is barred to our fishermen. We've simply got to get away from that being the way that we work. We do need our ministers speaking at the top table in Europe. We need them there speaking for our fishing interests. And as I said all these years ago, even Ross Finney would make better decisions than Franz Fischler. But Richard, praise indeed, but Richard Lockhead has done well. We have managed to negotiate something that's appropriate to our circumstances, but he can do even better if he has the powers of a normal country. Let me absolutely share with Tavish the necessity of dealing with the issue for our pelagic fleets. It is absolutely appalling that we haven't been able to solve that. I don't know how to, and you don't hear that often in Parliament, but for heaven's sake, we've got to get together and find out the answer, because we need it, and we need it now.
Thank you very much. I now call on Rhoda Grant to be followed by Rob Gibson. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government are rightly concerned about the mismanagement by Europe of our fishing stock, but they themselves presided over what could have been a potentially catastrophic situation at home this year. The West Coast prawn fishery faced closure in the summer due to overfishing, and the impact that this would have had on the communities in the West Coast is immeasurable. Fishermen in these areas are unable to pick and choose where they fish, and the fish processors and onshore jobs dependent on local landings to keep their industry alive would also have been devastated, and they provide jobs where there are very few alternative forms of employment. Economic devastation was averted at the last minute. However, it should have never come to this. And the Cabinet Secretary will say he can't second-guess fish stock and availability. And that's so. However, he can act when he sees a problem emerge. And it's the speed of that action that has left us with a problem this next month. And at this moment in time, it is still unclear what fishermen in that area will be fishing next week. That's impossible for people planning crew and staffing levels, and impossible for processors who need to meet orders. Should they be taking them, or will there be no fishing for the next few weeks? He needs to make that announcement soon, and he needs to allow both the fleet and the processors onshore to plan ahead. He needs to take responsibility for the situation and make sure it never happens again, because there's real concern that the same thing can happen all over again when these restrictions are lifted in May. And he needs to make sure there's a management structure in place that protects the fishery and those dependent communities. Otherwise, a similar situation will arise next year. Presiding Officer, until we have management of our fisheries vested in our local communities, these situations will recur. It's only when our fishing fleet are responsible to future generations for the fish that they will inherit that we will see a step change in how our seas are managed. We see on the inshore fisheries and static gear boats have a marked difference in attitude, and this needs to be replicated through the whole industry to ensure that we leave a thriving stock to our children. And steps have been taken, but they need to go further. We need to protect things such as breeding grounds to allow fish time to breed, and make sure that also have periods where they're not disturbed in order that they can form shoals, allowing them to breed also. And while there are such things as total allowable catch and days at sea, those are quite blunt instruments when it comes to managing the sea. We need to take the attitude to the sea that we need to farm it to make sure that it's there for future generations. We are leading the way. We need to go further, but we also need to make sure that the rest of the EU come with us in this. Turning to discards, and a lot of people have mentioned that, and in a way it feels like Groundhog Day. I don't think there's been a fisheries debate where there hasn't been a unanimous outcry that discards are absolutely obscene. The world's resources are being thrown away, and we need to move towards zero discards, and certainly not backwards. We have to land all the fish that are caught to ensure that penalties are in place to stop fishermen actively pursuing species that require protection. But we also need to make sure that everything is brought ashore and landed and marketed, cutting the waste. Because throwing the dead fish back is wasteful, but it also causes an eco-imbalance that damages our seas more widely. And the measures that need to be put in place need to balance the cost of landing the fish. If the penalties are too great, the fishermen will choose to discard themselves in order to make room for a more lucrative catch. But if the penalties are not great enough, then it leads to people actually going out and fishing for those fish if it's seen as a lucrative catch. Can I touch very briefly on the mackerel negotiations, and I think join with others in our great disappointment that no progress has been made, and hopefully progress will be made. But is it not time that the EU need to look at sanctions to protect that fishery and make sure that our fishermen are protected? It seems wrong that we had status to show that we were fishing the mackerel sustainably, and that's been removed through no action of our own but action of other states, and we need to take steps to make sure that happens. Just in closing, I was a little tickled at Graham Day's comments about how those negotiations would be so much better if Scotland were an independent country. And given this week's interventions from the President of the EU, I think they would be better because we wouldn't be here. So they might be better for the Fisheries Cabinet Secretary because he wouldn't have a sleepless night. But unfortunately, we would have to abide by the outcome of those talks and have no seat at the table. So I was slightly amused at what Graham Day was saying. Presiding Officer, I believe that there are problems with those negotiations, and they are based on fishing alone, and we need to have a link between our fishing industries and the communities in which they are based. And we need to reclaim that link to make sure there is an incentive to manage for our future generations. Until we do this, we'll have this horse trading year on year.
Many thanks. Now call on Rob Gibson to be followed by Dave Thompson. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Rhoda Grant provides me with 3 areas in which I think it would be useful to take this debate on. I don't wish to repeat what previous members have said, but since she referred to the remarks of the EU President, José Manuel Barroso, in answers to BBC questions on an independent Scotland status vis-à-vis the EU membership, it has unintended consequences which she alluded to. If, as he argued, that we have to join the membership queue, then Spanish and other EU fishing boats would have to leave Scottish waters forthwith. And these deep holes to the east of Peterhead and so on might be protected a lot better. But I'd like to know what we're doing to get them protected at the present time from the UK government while we're in the EU. And of course, if common sense politics prevail, then Scotland will have a proper place at the top table to right the wrongs of the failed CFP and seek a settlement that will be sustainable for our fish, our fishing communities, and rebuild stocks that have been ruinously plundered over the CFP's decades of mistakes. And I believe that if this government uses science and natural justice, then Scotland will make best use of that top-table place. Because, after all, the Cyprus presidency comes from a country which is 1.1 million people, currently holds the presidency of the Council of the European Union and will lead the negotiations on the new CFP this month. Ireland, which follows that, has a population of 4.4 million and will take over the presidency in January next year. They will lead the negotiations on the crucial stages of the Common Fisheries Policy and the Common Agriculture Policy. And I believe, as Richard Lochhead said last Tuesday, the word around the Council of Ministers and throughout Europe is that it is good for a small country that knows what it's doing, has a key interest in some of the issues and makes them a priority, will be in the driving seat for these negotiations. That shows the power of small nations in Europe. Because given that fishing is relatively important to Scotland and the rest of the UK, it's vital that Scotland has that seat at the top table. Scottish vessels, certainly.
Mayor Baker.
The last time in this debate, Mark MacDonald argued similar points, and I questioned whether how less influence in Europe would actually help Scottish fishermen. But now the question must surely be how being out of Europe, or years of negotiation, how any of this would actually benefit Scottish fishermen.
Rob Gibson.
Well, for a start, given that we have approximately 70% of the UK's quotas of key stocks, that Scottish vessels land 84% of the total value of UK landings of key stocks, that Scottish vessels account for over 2/3 of regulated effort in the cod recovery zone, the Scottish fishing zone makes up 60% of UK waters, and so on, then Scotland would have a major say. And the last thing that's going to happen in Europe is anything other than common sense politics. So the wishes of the Labour Party that Scotland would be out of the EU are not shared by this party here at the present time. And I doubt if indeed José Manuel Barroso will be retired by that stage and someone more sensible will be in his place. And you wish to come back?
Mayor Baker.
The member does realise that votes will be based on population, not the number of fish.
Rob Gibson.
Well, I think we could do with a better measure than we're being given at the present time, and it's obvious that the trading that we're getting at the present time, horse trading in the middle of the night, doesn't help that one bit. Now, the next point I would like to make is this. When we're looking at questions of climate change and marine management and so on, Scotland has led the way in terms of the catching effort and the specifics of that. But I would have to put it to Jamie McGregor, and indeed to Rhoda Grant. Rhoda Grant talked about the need for us to farm fish. Jamie McGregor's interested in us fishing every prawn that's in the sea. At our committee, we came to the view that of the prawns which are caught in creels, that the buried prawns should be put back so that the stock can regenerate. How do you do that when you fish out every prawn that's in the sea in trawls? And that's not a subject that's simple, but it's one that we have to look at if we're going to actually find a sustainable fishery for the people in the Hebrides and the West Coast at the moment. Jamie McGregor.
Jamie McGregor.
I thank the member for taking intervention, and I also agree with the point he's making. However, trawler fishermen would put it to you that creels fish 24 hours a day and tend to pick up the very prawns he's talking about, the large female ones. And whereas a trawler may go over a piece of ground when the prawns are not up and actually not catch anything.
That's a very kind of argument which we're having in our committee at the present time, and it was creel fishermen who pointed out that they were setting an example, and I'm asking people who talk about farming things to address these kinds of points. Now, finally, I should suggest that in terms of the mackerel stocks, that there are unintended consequences, perhaps, on our northern ports in Scotland, as well as on the fleets, because the Icelandic and Faroese boats do land here, and I would hate to get into the situation where the whole of our processing sector is affected by this. So we ask the Cabinet Secretary, wish him well next week, to make sure that Scotland gets a good deal, but that indeed that Norway, that other independent nation which helps us with the negotiations with Iceland and Faroes, tries to find us some way forward in this. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Now call on Dave Thompson, to be followed by Elaine Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome this debate on the annual fisheries negotiations. The fishing industry is vital to the Scottish economy, and it is particularly important in my own constituency, where fishing is the main livelihood of many. Now, I want to start on a positive note by reminding you that the Malagan and North West Fishermen's Association and the Scottish Government, working together as the Scottish Langoustine Project, has secured a contract to provide high-quality West Coast prawns to 500 Sainsbury's stores throughout the UK. Now, prior to this contract, our West Coast prawns were exported to Spain and Portugal, amongst others, markets which are now in decline. This agreement, therefore, represents not only a great deal for UK consumers, who can now buy our high-quality Scottish products, but also offers a degree of security to the prawn fishermen in the Minch. From Sainsbury's point of view, the good practice of the West Coast prawn fishermen has meant they had a sustainable fishery, which offered a consistent supply for the supermarket. The security of income provided by this deal is a solid platform for growth, and I understand the project is making good progress and hopes to expand in the new year, with other supermarkets now interested. Of course, these projects depend on a steady supply of prawns, and this brings me to the inflexibility of the common fisheries policy, which has been highlighted for all to see by the move of the East Coast prawn fishermen to the West Coast fishery when their own supplies dried up. Unfortunately, because of the crazy common fisheries policy, there is currently no easy way to deal with this type of problem, a problem which has caused great uncertainty for the West Coast fishermen, as has already been said, who face the prospect of their fisheries being closed in January. However, I am pleased to welcome the Cabinet Secretary's assurances that options will be in place to ensure this doesn't happen. But I agree with him that it would be a far better situation for all involved if the regulatory framework was responsive enough to recognise and react to changing circumstances in a much more sensible way. It's clear that the common fisheries policy is not fit for purpose. It's failing Scottish fishermen, and it's been clear for many, many years. Another unfortunate symptom of this is the acknowledgement by fishermen, scientists and even the European Commission that the cod recovery plan is actually counterproductive and encourages discards, and yet we seem to be unable to make the necessary reforms. Our fishermen faced further reductions in effort control in 2013. This nonsense, it must be stopped, and I wish the Cabinet Secretary well in his efforts to knock some sense into the heads of the Brussels bureaucrats. There are, of course, a number of quota increases. West Coast prawns and North Sea haddock, whiting and herring are all expected to rise next year, in recognition of our fishermen's commitment to sustainable practices. However, other misguided quota cuts may have the effect of driving up discards. For West Coast fishermen, the decline in the haddock, monkfish and megrim quotas, coupled with an increase in the prawn quota, could mean an increase in discards, which represent an unacceptable waste of fish, as we are all agreed. The large decrease in the haddock quota of 48% also seems to be at odds with what is being seen on the grounds by fishermen, and perhaps further scientific advice is necessary before making such a large reduction in that quota. We all know the positive impact that the adoption of selective gear can have, and our fishermen are to be commended on their enthusiasm for taking these measures, but ultimately their efforts are being undermined by a regulatory system which is not responsive to local needs. Fisheries do not respect international boundaries and are complex, making cooperation with our European neighbours essential if we are to fish sustainably. Scottish fishermen have worked incredibly hard in very challenging circumstances to make huge progress on reducing discards and ensuring that our stocks remain sustainable, while delivering the economic benefits that we and our fishing communities depend upon. The future of the Scottish fishing industry requires that we promote these practices internationally and ensure all states fish in accordance with the principle of sustainability. The European Union is, unfortunately or fortunately, whatever way you look at it, the best forum to formulate and agree our future actions. But the current common fisheries policy framework must be reformed to address its shortcomings. At a time of such economic hardship, the obscenity of wastage through discards is something we all agree must be dealt with. Presiding Officer, I am confident that the Cabinet Secretary will push for the best deal for Scottish fishermen. The Scottish Langoustine project highlights the high standards of our fishing industry and shows what can be achieved when government and industry work together. It is essential that the UK ministers appreciate how important our fishing industry is and do all they can to secure the best deal for Scottish fishermen. But how much better it would be if our distinctive voice and needs had a distinctive Scottish voice at the top table.
Many thanks. Now calling Dr. Elaine Murray to be followed by Richard Lyle. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, I don't record the progress of my life by the number of times I've spoken in this chamber. However, I could say I have spoken once or twice in the past of that, and in fact it's very nearly a year since I left the Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment Committee, and at first I was a little reluctant to accept the invitation to speak in this afternoon's debate, feeling that my experience might be a little bit out of date, not having been on the committee for a while. So I had a look through the minutes of the Raggy Committee of the 24th of November, and Angus MacDonald is absolutely right. I then had a feeling of déjà vu. Indeed, it reminded me of the saying that the wheels of the Lord grind exceedingly slow but exceedingly fine. Now, I'm not quite sure how fine the considerations of the EU are, but their wheels are certainly exceedingly slow, because there seemed to have been very little progress since the video conference we'd had with the same two MEPs, Stuart Stevenson and Ian Houghton, a year earlier. And I think that's sort of disappointing that things don't seem to be progressing. I'll say a little more about that later. Others taking part in this debate, speaking on behalf of their local fishing communities, and are able to talk extensively, have talked a lot about how the effects of the policies can affect their local communities. The fish which are important to my local economy and my constituency don't come within the CFP. They swim in from the Atlantic Ocean and up the rivers Nith, Annan and Esk, providing opportunities for angling and half netting, or else they're sometimes farmed up in the West Coast and brought down for processing. And I would concur with the Minister's view that we should be eating fishy things for our Christmas, because if you go to well-known retailers, you will find fishy products which are processed in Dumfriesshire. It's one that says this is not just food, so that will give you an idea where you go to find it. It is a ridiculous situation in the CFP that the fact that, for example, that cod stocks, thanks to the technical conservation measures which were predominantly developed here, a 20% reduction is still being required, despite the fact that our stocks are actually increasing in the North Sea. And indeed the situation others have talked about, where law-abiding mackerel fishers in Scotland and the UK may lose a share of the mackerel quota to compensate for greedy fishers elsewhere in the Faroes and in Iceland. If that was the way in which justice worked normally, we would all be up in an outcry. And there is absolutely nobody who believes that the common fisheries policy under which these negotiations are taking place has worked. It has not produced sustainable fisheries, a sustainable EU market, or sustainable livelihoods for our fishermen. Maximal sustainable yields based on single species, as others have said, do not work in mixed demersal fisheries. The policy has been criticised from all sides: environmentalists, fishermen, politicians, scientists, and now even the EU Commission. Now, during last week's statement, I raised concerns about the potential delay in introducing the reformed common fisheries policy, and in answer, the Cabinet Secretary described some of the consequences of that and of the dispute between the European Parliament and the European Council. This is holding up the renewal of technical regulations, and this could also seriously affect conservation measures, as boxes which are currently closed could not remain so. The MEPs who took part in the video conference with the Iraqi Committee advised that there were around 2,600 controversial compromise amendments, and if these are delayed until January or February next year, the plenary vote probably would not take place until April or May, and in that case there would only be limited time to get the second reading through before the end of the year. Now, we all know, of course, that the European Parliaments are taking place in June 2014, and the new Commission would be appointed after that. So then there would be no legal basis for rolling over the European Maritime Fisheries Fund, and also, if the reformed CFP had not been implemented by 2014, according to Struan Stevenson, the European Parliament would be back to square one, which I understand would mean that the opportunity to reform the crazy process by which fishing quotas are negotiated annually would be lost. And this, I think, would spell little short of disaster for Scotland's fishing communities. These are points, of course, on which we all agree. We maybe need to talk a little about the points on which we do not agree, and indeed the effect of Scotland leaving the United Kingdom. Now, I think there is an extremely strong case for Scotland leading these negotiations. The Scottish industry is particularly important. Most of the fish are in our waters. And I think there is my colleagues in Westminster might not agree with this, but I think there is a very strong case for the Scottish Cabinet Secretary to lead these negotiations. However, I think you would be in a stronger position leading a delegation representing 78 MEPs, a population of 63 million people, leading that delegation than leading a delegation of maybe 7 MEPs and a population of 5.3 million. I honestly believe that giving Scotland the correct place in these negotiations would actually mean that we have a stronger voice, and I strongly believe that in this, so long as Scotland is given the appropriate position, the position which is right for us, given the importance of our industry, we are definitely, I'm in my last minute, we are definitely better together on the fishing industry than we would be if Scotland was apart. However, having said that, and I know the Cabinet Secretary will not agree with me and the people over that side of the will not agree on that, I do wish the Cabinet Secretary and his team the very best of luck next week in getting these very important negotiations underway, because they are so important to a vital, much valued and much loved Scottish industry.
Many thanks. I now call on Richard Lyle to be followed by Claire Adamson. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Officer, firstly, can I pay tribute to all who work in this industry? The achievements of Scotland's fishing sector over the last few years has been impressive. Can I agree with the view by members that the discarding fish is a waste of valuable resource? This government should oppose the EU's proposed 20% cut in the North Sea cod quota in 2013, which is threatening the sustainable fishing practices of Scottish fishermen. Scotland, with one of its most significant fisheries resources in Europe, should have a seat in the negotiations and take its turn leading negotiations. No one can deny that the Cabinet Secretary in this SNP government fights hard for Scotland's fishermen. The government should be guided by science and stock sustainability, protecting the well-being of our industry and the communities who depend on it, and discard free fisheries, as already has been stated. The International Council for the Exploration of Sea advice suggests quota increases of North Sea haddock, whiting, saithe, megrim, North Sea herring and West of Scotland nethrops. But the advice also points to reductions in a number of other stocks: North Sea cod, West Coast haddock, rockall cod, West of Scotland and North Sea monkfish, reduction for North Sea nethrops and a reduction for West of Scotland megrim. Increases are welcome, but any reductions are not. The guiding principle of any of these decisions must follow the science. Reductions in cod quotas are not backed by scientific evidence. On the subject of quota cuts, and I'd like to quote the Cabinet Secretary, who did say in November, "It is outrageous that once again Scotland is battling proposed cuts that are on the table for legal reasons rather than what's best for the fishery." Thankfully, a number of countries are joining forces to resist any such crazy cuts. And I've made it clear to Mr Bennion that we cannot accept these unjustified proposals and expect full backing from the UK. But will we get that backing? I am not convinced we shall. Proposed cuts to mackerel quotas, yes.
Alex Ferguson.
If he could point to anything he's heard while he's been on the Rural Affairs Committee that points him to make such an extraordinary statement as that.
Richard Lyle.
Sadly, I've heard things many a time from the UK government which I've later on... yes.
I think the member for Gibberley might be able to just be a wee bit helpful here, and also to Mr Ferguson, because, of course, it has to be remembered that at the time that Ted Heath took us into the EU, we discovered under the 30 years rule some years later that, of course, as far as the Conservative government, UK Conservative government at the time were concerned, the Scottish fishing industry was regarded as expendable.
Richard Lyle.
Can I totally agree with my colleague in regards to that? Proposed cuts to mackerel quotas are a direct result of overfishing by ferries and Icelandic vessels. They are essentially a reward for their unsustainable practices. I note that talks in October between Iceland, the Faroes, Norway and the EU, which a Scottish Government official was present, again failed to reach an agreement on mackerel quotas. Until 2009, the Faroes were part of a three-way agreement with the EU and Norway. 2012, the Faroese declared themselves a quota more than 5 times their agreed share in 2009. Wonder why that is. I think they're independent. Iceland caught very little mackerel prior to 2008. They've never been part of a coastal states agreement, but they have significantly increased their mackerel catch in recent years. In September, the European Parliament progressed plans to make sanction measures available to the EU. Will they use them? Well, we'll see. I compliment the Cabinet Secretary on his diligence and his excellent work for Scotland's fishermen. Given the huge importance of the fishing sector to Scotland, the well-being of fishing communities in Scotland is imperative. The Scottish Government should be in EU talks re-fishing, and as already stated, there are over 5,000 fishermen employed in the industry in 2011. How many will there be when the new figures are available in 2012? The Scottish Government already has significant successes in fighting for Scotland's fisheries sector. The Scottish Government got the European Commission to remove rules that were causing large-scale discarding of haddock. The Scottish Government has also got the Commission to reverse a regulation that would have caused swinging and unnecessary cuts on Scottish vessels' time at sea. And they've also got agreement from across Europe to make the Commission couldn't try and do the same again. This Government has continued to put pressure on the Commission and Norway to ensure we can continue our groundbreaking catch quota scheme for cod, which has enabled fishermen to land more than whilst catching less and stopping discarding. This is in the face of heavy Norwegian opposition to the proposal. The achievements of Scotland's fisheries sector over the last few years have been impressive. It is therefore correct that the Parliament should support the industry to the hilt. It is only by Scotland taking its rightful place in the world with independence can we resolve this finally.
Many thanks. I now call on Claire Adamson, after which we'll move to closing speeches. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Living as I do and representing landlocked central Scotland, I do confess that fishing is not an area that I have been familiar with. Indeed, I would say to Mr Stevenson that I'm in danger of being the Franz Fischler of this debate in that respect. However, since recently joining the European and External Relations Committee, I am becoming aware of the importance of the fishing industry to Scotland's economy and the communities which host our fishing fleet. Yesterday, Presiding Officer, I took part in a debate in this chamber that was a motion that was about the important role that scientific evidence plays in informing decision-making recognises the contribution made by scientists and engineers in the Scottish Government, its agencies and delivery partners to the international reputation of Scotland through the provision of evidence and advice. And I think it's very timely that we're having this discussion about fishing today, which of course we have to recognise the scientific advice in this area as we move forward in the negotiations. And I do recognise the comments made by the Cabinet Secretary about his frustration that the structures in the European Union and the structures with the policy at the moment make it very difficult to have that recognised. In yesterday's debate, there were many accolades for Scottish scientists, both past and present, and the achievement of Anne Glover in her appointment as the first Chief Scientific Advisor to the President of the European Commission was noted. In a recent interview in the Biologist magazine, Anne Glover was asked about the most important science issues that politicians need to tackle today. And in her answer, she said, understanding climate change and ensuring that as we look towards alternatives to energy generation, such as biofuels, we are not displacing crop growth and damaging food security, as food security, water security and the challenges of a sustainable economic growth are the four most important issues. And our fishing industry is affected by all of these issues. And I'd like to highlight these, but given time, maybe I'll not get through them all. But if I could start with food security. Being part of a modern and responsible nation means taking our responsibilities as good global citizens very seriously indeed. And I think the 2009 Climate Change Scotland Act is an example of Scotland's commitment. However, I am old enough to remember the problems of the Common Agricultural Policy, whose initial principles and objectives have not changed since 1958. The unintentional consequences, of course, is the scandal of the 1980s of the wine lakes and the butter mountains, caused by complex systems of quotas and support prices. And, Presiding Officer, I do hope that we have learned from this. Because I agree with my colleagues who have mentioned this already, when the Food and Agriculture Organisation of the United Nations reports that 870 million world citizens are chronically undernourished and that death from hunger is still the biggest health risk in the world, then a policy that includes discards is nothing less than an obscenity. And I support every effort of the Cabinet Secretary to negotiate an end to this wasteful practice. I note that this practice is equally distasteful to the fishermen as it is to members of the public. And I also commend the Scottish Fleet for the work that it has done in reducing discards from 43% to 25%. I'd like to mention Anne Glover's comments about sustainable growth and the challenges of delivering jobs in economic sustainability. Scotland's seas are economically productive, and while the fishing industry contributes £500 million a year to that, it's estimated that the marine areas generate over £3.5 billion to the economy. Nearly 40,000 people are employed in the marine sector, and that represents 1.6% of the Scottish employment. Fishing takes place in all our waters, and agriculture, both fin fish and shellfish, takes place on our west coast and east coast. And the challenges of this have been very well highlighted in the debate this afternoon. And our marine life also includes cooling water abstraction for power stations, treatment of wastewater and dredge spoil. Our seabed has cables in it that contribute to our communications. They're also used for leisure activities and a major tourist draw because of their natural and cultural heritage in this area. But perhaps the greatest yet untapped opportunity is the enormous potential of marine renewable energy generation from offshore wind, waves, tides. It started to be harnessed. And there's potential for storage of carbon dioxide under the seabed and carbon capture and storage. And all of these technologies have the potential to tackle climate change, which of course is vital also to our fishing communities. So we have to ensure that the pressure exerted by human activity on our marine environment is done so with due consideration to the delicate ecosystems, and our policy making and our position in the negotiations to be looking towards enhancing the economic potential of all our marine environments. Can I say just before finishing to my Labour colleagues, I don't want our Minister going cap in hand, asking for permission to speak and lead in negotiations in Scotland's vital industries. I want to be at him at the top table. And I can say to the Labour politicians who speak of population and numbers of MEPs being key to influence in Europe, they do a great disservice to the smaller nations in Europe in doing so, and it also flies in the face of the principles of the European Union.
Many thanks. We now move to the winding up speeches, and I call on Tavish Scott. A generous 6 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. This has, on the whole, been an extremely positive debate. I cite Dave Thompson's contribution in the latter half of it. One discordant note. I thought to attack, as Richard Lyle did, the UK Fisheries Minister Richard Bennion was wrong on two accounts. Firstly, when Richard Bennion was recently in Shetland meeting fishing skippers there, he not only praised Richard Lochhead and the work Richard Lochhead had been doing, but he made a particular point in front of the President of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation of saying that on the cod recovery plan, the Scottish Government and the UK Government were working hand in hand to get that right, because it was that important to our fishing interests. So I think when some people stand up from the back benches and have a go at a UK Minister, for goodness sake, have the basis to have some facts that support that argument. For this Minister, this UK Minister, recognises the importance of the Scottish Minister, is working with him, and actually the two of them will achieve a lot for an industry that we should all, instead of scoring political points, as Mr Lyle chose to do, we should actually support. Can I only but praise Stuart Stevenson's 400... I'll come to Angus MacDonald in a minute, because he said something I entirely both agreed with and also didn't agree with. But can I entirely praise Stuart Stevenson's 442 speeches in Parliament? I can't say I count mine, and most of them are probably instantly forgettable, but that's not something we could ever levy at Mr Stevenson. He mentioned Franz Fischler. Well, my goodness me, there's a name from the past which I had rather wished I'd forgotten all about, and I wasn't hugely grateful for him for reminding me of 2001. But Alistair Carmichael's comments that he quoted, I thought that was a very considered remark in the context of some of the things Alistair Carmichael says, although now that he's in government, he isn't so keen on remarks like that played back to him, a point I might say which proves the adage in politics that what goes around comes around. That is something I might just gently pray in aid in respect of my good colleagues on the nationalist benches. And I can assure Mr Stevenson, although I know he didn't make this point, that the Advocate General in the UK Government hasn't yet been reshuffled. I thought for a moment there I'd missed a reshuffle this afternoon. Now, he's a lawyer, and therefore it seems to me to be important to seamlessly move into lawyers and law. I take in general good spirits the point that SNP members make about independence. They're entirely entitled, of course, to make that argument. But I just say to them that when I see the French, the Dutch, and particularly the Spanish looking at the potential for Scottish independence, I see nations rubbing their hands in glee. Our chances of holding on to the Chevron box, against ITQ's relative stability in the face of the Spanish, who would just love to see a negotiation on Scottish fishing quotas, can only be imagined. And I do think, look, I am more than happy to debate the independence of fishing any time you want, because I do think there are some very, very severe dangers there. It doesn't matter what I think, but believe me, Scottish fishermen across our ports think that too. But that is, yes, of course.
Stevenson?
I just wonder if the rest of the UK and an independent Scotland would make common cause, because, of course, Scotland, looking at Croatia, who's just coming in, would be likely to have twice as many MEPs and a commissioner, neither of which we don't just now.
Tavish Scott.
I think the real point that Mr Stevenson, I'm sure, might concede, although probably not in public, is that whatever the negotiating priorities of any state seeking membership of the European Union, the negotiating priorities would be the most difficult aspect of whatever happens in the future. And at the very least, there is a deal of uncertainty as to how our industry would come out of that process. Now, I want to move on to the substantial issue, because actually I think, in fairness, I may say to the member, in fairness to the member, this has been a pretty positive debate on the issues that confront the Minister, and we have touched, of course, on independence. I'm not in any way denying the importance of that to some members, but let me just deal with what I think have been, if I may say so, rather more fundamentally important arguments. Now, the Minister, Stuart Stevenson, Angus MacDonald and others all made, in my view, entirely the right observations about the benefits that can flow from regionalisation, an argument that, or rather, a debate that both Stuart Stevens and I have made for many moons in this place. Indeed, so has Richard Lockhead. I think the point here is when Liam MacArthur and I met the aforementioned lawyer from the Cabinet, Mary Kitchener. She's still there, that's the point. She's still there. We met her just the other couple of weeks ago when Liam MacArthur and I were in Brussels. It was for the first time that she forwarded the proposition that I agreed with, which is that we, Brussels, should let go of fisheries management. It should be devolved to the North Sea, that therefore the Fisheries Minister in Scotland, the Fisheries Minister from Denmark, the Fisheries Ministers from the Member States around the North Sea should have the operational management responsibility for sorting out the science, the fish stocks, the effort, the quota, and so on and so forth. And yes, in conjunction, I heard Stuart Stevenson say from a sedentary position, yes, in conjunction with Norway as a non-EU member. Now, that is the right approach. That's what should be happening. We should make sure the European Parliament delivers that. And that's all I would say to those such as Angus MacDonald who were citing other MEPs. Believe me, if I could do some things about some of my MEPs, I would be a very happy man, but it's not completely within my gift. But on the same context, I might just say to Mr MacDonald, he might wish to be slightly careful about the group his colleagues are in with in the European Parliament. We, believe me, all have these problems. So there we are. Finally, Deputy Presiding Officer, in terms of some of the other detailed points were raised on mackerel. Can I just countenance against? I appreciate that Claire Baker made this point in all seriousness and with a lot of knowledge of the issue. But can I countenance against any signal to Iceland and the Faroes that mackerel is a negotiating position? If we give away our position on mackerel, and I'm very pleased the Cabinet Secretary hasn't done this, and I'm very pleased he's working with the UK Government on this. If we give that away, they will move, by which I mean Iceland, they will move remorselessly on to whitefish stocks. This is a country, Iceland, whose economy after the financial crash is completely based on fisheries. They need mackerel for currency purposes, and they will move it on. And the point on the processing industry, Claire Baker, or I forget, someone mentioned Angus MacNeill in the recent Commons debate last week. The point on the whitefish industry is that you could source 1 million tonnes of cod from the Barents Sea at the moment, and there are, therefore, other ways in which our processing industry, in this case the Grimsby processing industry, but also affects Scotland, could source those whitefish stocks. It doesn't need to come from Iceland, and I think we need to be very careful about sending any signal to those nations that they can get away with illegal fishing. I certainly will, Deputy Presiding Officer. Just to finish with the final point that Mr Lockhead, the Cabinet Secretary, rightly made in terms of the cod recovery plan. Fishing effort in the last decade has been cut by 63% in Scotland, and yet the Commission say that's not enough. If there's one message that I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will want to take to these negotiations, we've played our part. Let's hope we get a good deal out of December.
Right, thank you very much. Now call on Alex Ferguson, a generous 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As Tavish Scott said, this has been a largely positive debate, with one or two exceptions. I will confine my remarks to try and keep it on that positive basis. Like others, I'm absolutely delighted that the Business Bureau managed to find time to include this important debate in our schedule again. I'm even more delighted than I was originally, because it gave us all a chance to enjoy what I might call the aqua reminiscences of Stuart Stevenson. Always a pleasure. But in a strange way, there is something quite fitting about the fact that the week's delay that we've had has resulted in us having this debate immediately following yesterday's debate on the role of scientific evidence and advice in public policy. Because it seems to me that the balance of Scottish scientific evidence and advice that comes from our fishing industry, which is an industry that has and continues to work commendably closely with the scientific community, that evidence would suggest that we're doing a lot of things right here in Scotland, but that the resulting evidence and advice that is available is effectively ignored by our masters in Brussels, who seem determined to impose a centralised management regime on an industry for which the term localism was surely coined. Indeed, the Rodust Amendment, to which Angus MacDonald referred, is a prime example of the sort of ill-thought-out type of solution that seems to come out of Brussels. If ever there was an industry sector within the EU that demands local management, then it has to be the fishing sector. Roderick Campbell spoke very well on this issue. If there is one single outcome that I would want to see from the ongoing attempts to reform the common fisheries policy, it would be the proposal for regionalisation of fisheries management, not just as a meaningless phrase, Presiding Officer, but as a genuine reality. Without wanting to sound too complacent, it does seem to me that the Scottish fishing sector has a pretty fair idea of what needs to be done to ensure sustainability of our stocks and is perfectly capable of delivering it. And yet it seems to be increasingly prevented from doing so by the ongoing wranglings within Europe that many members have mentioned in the debate, which were described both last week and this by Tavish Scott as the lunatics taking over the asylum, and that year on year they seem to deliver the polar opposite of common sense as a way of sustainably managing our fisheries. And now it seems that those same lunatics are engaged in a new power struggle over who actually has the effective decision-making power to enable a new fisheries management plan to be put in place. Now, given the vital importance of having such a plan in place, it surely beggars belief that it could be blown out of the water at this stage by a sort of internal European trench warfare that has nothing to do with the sustainability of fish stocks, of fishing fleets, or, as many members have mentioned, and perhaps most importantly, of those who man the vessels and the onshore industry that depends upon them. Presiding Officer, if you wrote this all down as the script of a play, people would say you had taken fantasy a step too far and that it was entirely beyond belief, and indeed I often think that's exactly what it is. Now, as Jamie McGrigor has highlighted in the amendment in his name, in recent years the Scottish industry has been spearheading a range of conservation initiatives that include technical modifications to fishing gear and real-time area closures that has reduced discards and aided fish stock recovery for a wide range of species. Now, to those achievements, I would also mention once again the impact of the catch quota trials, again something many members have mentioned, which have had a huge success in reducing discards. But the worth of all of this tremendous effort is in great danger unless next week's talks can focus properly on a worked-out management plan for Scotland's whitefish and prawn fleets in 2013. And that means focusing primarily on quota and days at sea, and we can only do that sensibly if the local scientific evidence that is available to us is properly taken into account. If it is, it will show, as many members have said, without any doubt, that our cod stocks are recovering, along with several other species, that the measures to reduce discards that I mentioned a few minutes ago are effective. In other words, we can deliver a sustainable stock while cutting discards, and we can back that up scientifically. So it patently cannot make sense to impose a further cut in the number of days at sea for the Scottish fleet in 2013, just as it cannot make sense to propose a 20% cut in quota for cod, to pursue what the Cabinet Secretary himself referred to as a deeply dysfunctional cod recovery plan. And indeed, it's a plan which the science itself tells us is no longer serving its purpose. As the Scottish Fishermen's Federation points out, the larger part of the Scottish fishing industry is subjected to constraints in days at sea, and the governing regulation has for a long time been widely recognised by scientists, fisheries managers and the industry as being fatally flawed. Presiding Officer, we all know that much of what is being proposed is counter to both Scotland's interests and to the interests of fish stocks themselves. The Cabinet Secretary has been rightly bullish and robust in his statements of what is and what is not acceptable in terms of the outcome of next week's talks, and we genuinely wish him well as he heads off for next week's talks, just as Rob Gibson did, although that's probably just about the only part of Rob Gibson's speech that I did agree with, I have to say. Well, not the only bit, but one of the few bits. Sorry, I thought he was going to intervene there. I've no doubt we'll talk about it on the committee. But we genuinely wish the Cabinet Secretary well in pursuing the outcome. And I would simply, in closing, Presiding Officer, express the hope that the outcome lives up to not just our hopes and expectations, but to the needs and the requirements of our fisheries sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Ferguson. I now call on Claudia Beamish. Ms Beamish, you have a generous 8 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want first, along with other members, to pay tribute to our fishing fleets around Scotland who work in frequently very challenging conditions and have often done much towards our conservation efforts in the coast around Scotland. Today, members from across the political spectrum have all voiced concerns over the state of Europe's shared fisheries. I hope it is safe to say that we are all in broad agreement that a number of issues must be addressed if we are to achieve a sustainable and economically viable fishing fleet and fisheries for future generations. This must all be considered in the context of biodiversity and climate change, as some members have stressed, including Claire Adamson. It is essential also if we are to achieve the good environmental status by 2020, as laid out in the EU's Marine Strategy Directive, Framework Directive, which maybe is one of the better aspects that we might think about today in relation to the EU, unlike some of the other remarks which have, I agree, have been very challenging in terms of how we can move forward for Scotland's fisheries. A number of important issues have been raised today, and I would particularly like to draw attention to the amendment to the Cabinet Secretary's motion, referred to by some of my colleagues, which requests that the Scottish Government publish the terms of the UK Concordat on fisheries management, which, from this side of the Chamber, we believe would be helpful at this stage. However, in my closing remarks, I would like to concentrate on 4 main points, which I believe are central to the ongoing European negotiations. And the Cabinet Secretary has stressed science, support for fishing communities, and tackling discards. The first of these main points I want to cover has been covered by a lot of members, but I do want to stress the point, and I hope not labour it too much, is the intended cod recovery plan. I would like to join the Cabinet Secretary in his trepidation over the impending plan and agree with him and many other members that the proposed 20% cut in quotas, as well as the cut in the annual days at sea, is likely to have a profoundly negative impact on the state of the cod fishery. This concern has been voiced by many stakeholders, including the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. And indeed, Claire Adamson stressed the obscenity of discards in a world of food poverty. From previous experience with mixed fisheries, we can expect that imposing these cuts in quotas will merely result in increased discards. And I know members will agree with me that the practice of discarding dead fish is not in any way helpful and must be prevented. It is simply unnecessary and counterproductive, and I know the Cabinet Secretary will do all he can to prevent this plan from being put in place. The Cabinet Secretary stressed, and I quote, that some of the EU posturing was self-indulgent legal bickering, and this must not prevail. The bad compromises of Brussels were also stressed by Angus MacDonald. And Dennis Robertson highlighted the impact on the processing industry of the failure to reach agreement, which our amendment also highlights. Graham Day highlighted the fears of young people he met in Peterhead this summer about the future of our fishing and the processing industries as well, which I know we are all concerned about across the Chamber. And my colleague Elaine Murray highlighted that the delay in negotiations endangers the Marine Fisheries Fund, which could affect fragile coastal communities as well. I would also like to add my voice to the unanimous call for the way forward on mackerel negotiations, in spite of perhaps what is a misunderstanding by Tavish Scott, who seems to have misinterpreted our position from these benches. As members are well aware, the continuing dispute with Iceland and the Faroe Islands must be resolved. If not, this already rapidly depleting fishery will be in danger of being beyond recovery. Their decision to grant themselves quotas, which according to Spice exceed the scientific advice by more than 40%, is extreme folly and is frankly simply unacceptable, coming from 2 supposedly mature and developed countries. And the loss of Scottish mackerel's MSC status is simply wrong and unjust through no fault of our own. The Cabinet Secretary has indicated he is not willing to resume talks, if I understand this correctly, until the representatives of Iceland and Faroe Islands are prepared to negotiate properly and move away from their unilaterally declared quotas. Labour agrees in principle with this stance and that sensible negotiations are certainly the most desirable way forward, but if this does not happen, it is imperative that sanctions are enforced. They are not a risk-free solution, as we all know, but we must make a stand on this position if necessary. As members will also be aware, quotas and days at sea are but one aspect of the efforts to ensure a sustainable and economically viable fisheries for our future in Scotland. Though these provisions are indeed important, I, along with many of my colleagues, believe that technical measures, specifically modernisation of technical gear, are essential to the functioning of shared fisheries. We have heard in the Cabinet Secretary's ministerial statement that the new gear being used by the North Sea prawn fleet has resulted in far less unwanted catch than was previously the case. And this is a prime example of innovative and flexible fishing practices, which should be recognised by other member states and, if possible, replicated. Though I am sure that this is already in his mind, I would call on the Cabinet Secretary to pursue this line of policy in the remaining stages of the negotiations. Rhoda Grant stressed the need for fair management so that crew and staffing are not put in an impossible situation of not knowing from week to week where they are in terms of going out to sea or not. These specific points bring me on to another, more general point regarding EU fisheries policy. The expected failure of the cod recovery scheme, the breakdown in mackerel negotiations and the lack of technical information sharing demonstrate the importance of a general reform of the common fisheries policy. It is a hopeless situation, not just for the people involved, but for the countries that have fishing in their as one of their important industries, that people have to negotiate through the night annually. And this must end. And we wish the Cabinet Secretary well this time with the negotiations, but let's hope this is the last of these negotiations, because the common fishery policy has, as we all know, been in place for a number of years, and it really doesn't seem to have resulted in a coherent European-wide fisheries policy that was intended. The CFP has merely resulted in a tedious, frankly, and unproductive backwards and forwards between member states, and I would agree with the Cabinet Secretary that a greater emphasis on regionalisation is essential, as stressed by many members here today, so as to properly take advantage of the various forms of expertise held by European countries, especially, of course, our own. Margaret McDougall is right to emphasise that local knowledge is essential, and within the context of a broad fisheries policy Europe-wide, local groups and fishermen within countries must have the flexibility to make decisions as long as these are based on science and take sustainability into careful consideration. I think all members would agree that this round of negotiations would be an ideal opportunity for discussions about the future reform that can take place. The current policy of centralisation has proved unfit for purpose, and I would urge the Cabinet Secretary to redouble his efforts, which I know he will, in calling for discussions on reforms so as to ensure that the stocks of Europe's waters are properly managed for now and for future generations. And from this side of the Chamber, we wish him well with the negotiations next week. Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary, in advance of those negotiations last week, I'm sure you will manage to continue this debate until 4:59, so you've got 12 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by welcoming Tavish Scott to his first fishing debate in his new role as his party's Rural Affairs spokesperson, and I trust that the supportive sentiment for the Scottish Government's position is a trend that he means to continue in future speeches. I also welcomed his reference to the fact that many of our fishermen are now tweeting, and indeed he referred to a tweet he received from one of the Shetland fishermen. Can I assure him that I receive on a daily basis many tweets from Scotland's fishermen? But I don't think I'll be quoting them in this chamber, because I'm not quite sure I'd be doing myself many favours if I did that. I also welcome Stuart Stevenson's speech. He indicated to the chamber that he's now made over 400 speeches to this chamber over the past decade or so. I think I can remember every single speech he has made in this chamber for one reason or another. I particularly noted his lawyer bashing in his speech, which of course followed the speech from the eminent lawyer in this chamber of Rod Campbell, who I'm sure did not take it personally, but it did show that we do have good lawyers, as well as some of the more unpopular lawyers perhaps that are based out in Brussels. But I thought it was a good debate, and as ever, prior to the very difficult end of year negotiations, there was a lot of unanimity across the chamber and a lot of unity across the political parties. I do believe that unity is reflected across Scotland, and Scotland is speaking with one voice ahead of next week's negotiations. We have the political parties in this chamber, we have the industry, we have the environment groups, we have the scientists, we have our wider fishing communities all wanting a successful outcome at next week's negotiations, and all sharing concerns over some of the same issues. And indeed, it's been very notable that we are all very concerned that many outside influences are threatening our country and threatening our fishing communities. I do believe, of course, as many members have reflected, that does tell a story in itself, and perhaps I'll return to that later on in my remarks. But this is very much a debate about Scotland's economy, about our marine environment, about communities, and as Claire Adamson and Rhoda Grant referred to, it's also about ensuring there's food for our tables. And it's always an appropriate opportunity to recall that too many fishermen have paid the ultimate price in bringing food to our tables over the years. And it's also a debate about real families and real livelihoods. Families who want to enjoy Christmas, knowing that they'll still have a livelihood in 2013. And it's about families and real livelihoods who work on our fishing vessels, who work in our processing factories on shore, who work at the quayside as painters, electricians, at the local cafes, or wherever. It's about all of those families and livelihoods throughout Scotland and all our communities that many of us represent, who rely on a successful outcome at these end-of-year negotiations, and who will be biting their nails over the next few days or so, wondering what on earth lies around the corner for them. Now, what has also struck me, as ever, with these debates is that the whole issue over cod stocks has been the central thread through much of the contributions in this chamber, because whilst cod is just one stock in our rich waters, and by no means whatsoever one of our more valuable stocks, but still an important stock, it does dominate, because the cod recovery plan dominates. It dominates the ability and frustrates the ability of the rest of our fishermen in Scotland to catch our other stocks in the same waters because of the wide, ever-ranging impact of the cod recovery plan. Briefly up.
Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. We've heard a lot today about lawyers and some of their foibles, to say the least. In terms of cod recovery, some of the science is ignored by the media, and we've had some real scare stories about that in recent times, which I'm sure is not helpful in these negotiations. Could we also call for responsible media as well as responsible lawyers in this issue?
Cabinet Secretary.
I do think it's a very important point. I recently spoke out about some irresponsible headlines in some of our newspapers in Scotland in recent months, which does not help the public perception of the very good work that's taking place in Scottish waters, thanks to the sacrifices of Scotland's fishermen. Because it is the case that the cod recovery plan is now turned into an altar in which our fleet is being sacrificed. We all want the cod stocks to recover, and they are recovering. I'll return to that shortly. But the plan is frustrating our ability to catch these other stocks in our waters, because the cod recovery plan simply does not work in the mixed fishery we have in our seas, with many different stocks, rich stocks, swimming together and caught in the same nets. But the stock is recovering, and it's all thanks to the fleet's sacrifices. But the cod recovery plan is unresponsive, does not respond to the biology in our seas, it's inflexible, it doesn't respond to circumstances or the needs of other fisheries in the same waters, and of course it's counterproductive, because it's meant to conserve fish stocks, stop discards, but is actually causing discards and potentially causing damage to stocks as well. But discards will result from this cod recovery plan, because you cannot have a cut in cod quota when the actual stock itself is recovering and is ever present in more parts or more areas of our seas, because it's more difficult for the fleet to avoid, and it's the biggest fish just about that swims in the North Sea, therefore it's very, very difficult to avoid. Therefore, this plan is deeply, deeply flawed. Also, the automatic cut in days that's proposed by the cod recovery plan is also counterproductive, because our fishermen, as Tavish Scott said, need time at sea to catch their legitimate quotas. And they have to catch those quotas in the right areas of sea, and hopefully at the same time avoid the cod stocks, but they don't have time to go to where the fish is that they have legitimate quotas for. Then they end up catching the stocks they're not meant to catch in some circumstances, and again, that's counterproductive. But to avoid that cut in days at sea, to avoid the cut in quota, we have the obstacle of a legal dispute that's taking place at the moment within the European Union. This is a legal dispute between the ministers, that's the EU Council, and the European Commission. So we have a legal view on how we can achieve a freeze in days at sea from the Commission, which is it should be referred to the European Parliament and take many months going through the co-decision process. And we have a legal view from the European Council, working with the Member States and the Presidency, which says there's actually a way around that we can achieve a freeze by splitting the regulation, allowing one part to go to the European Parliament, but keeping the actual part we want to use to get a freeze and not a cut in days at sea within the EU Council next week at the Council of Ministers. That dispute is not helping anyone.
Cabinet Secretary for taking intervention. Does he agree that rather than have these annual gladiatorial battles every December, we do need to adopt multi-annual plans for the key target fish? But the Council seemed to be blocking all multi-annual plans based on this extraordinary argument about who does what under the terms of the Lisbon Treaty. What can the Cabinet Secretary do about this?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as I said, this is a dispute between the European Council and the European Parliament, and our fishermen don't want to hear about disputes, they want to hear about solutions so they can have a livelihood in 2013. This, of course, is an indictment of the Common Fisheries Policy. Here we have a situation, just think about this, here we have a situation where the scientists, the politicians, the fishing communities, the environmentalists and everyone else who has an interest in this issue agree the cod recovery plan is not working and it's damaging. Yet we have a common fisheries policy which cannot provide a way in which we can fix the cod recovery plan. So that's an indictment of the common fisheries policy. And of course the reason why the EU-Norway talks were postponed until January is because the EU-Norway talks were unable to agree a rollover of cod until the European Council in next week's negotiations finds a mechanism that can legally allow that to happen. That is why the postponement of the EU-Norway talks is actually a welcome development, because we much better have a more productive outcome in January than a damaging outcome last week. The key issue here is that cod stocks are actually recovering. Thanks to the fleet sacrifices, the stock has more than doubled since 2006. Our fishing fleet is taking a lead in the whole of Europe in terms of fisheries conservation. Real-time closures introduced by the Scottish fleet, the catch quota schemes which stops discards introduced by the Scottish fleet, many new innovative selective gears to reduce discards as well and avoid certain stocks introduced by the Scottish fleet. That is all good news. And Jamie McGregor asked why the catch quota schemes are not being expanded. That is something we've argued for vigorously over recent years, but unfortunately we don't have the support of the Norwegians over what is a shared stock with that country. And also, of course, the Conservation Credit Scheme introduced by this government in tandem with our industry has allowed our fleet, despite all the cuts in days at sea, to get back 70% more time than would have otherwise been the case if we had not led the way with those innovative measures from Scotland, now which is being emulated by other countries in Europe. But the scientists do say we can avoid this 20% cut that's being proposed by Europe. We can have a rollover of the cod stock for the next 2 or 3 years, and that will get us to where we want to be by 2015, which is a sustainable cod stock, and that's what we'll fight for next week at the negotiations. I do want to turn to the West Coast issues because the flexibility which we do want to get into the fishing negotiations is something that's desperately required on the West Coast of Scotland, and we're going to be paying close attention to the impact on the West Coast of Scotland of next week's negotiations. We have to maximise our valuable stocks in these waters. The monkfish and meregum opportunities are something we're paying close attention to, and of course protect the haddock fishery in those waters as well. One area we all agree on is that we need a fresh start for fishing policy in Scotland and in Europe. The CFP reform that's taking place just now must deliver for Scotland. The European Parliament actually is going to vote on Monday and Tuesday. There was talk of some members of that being postponed until next year. My understanding is that vote will now take place on Monday and Tuesday. You'll be glad to know that 2,000 or so amendments have now been whittled down to 104 amendments. But there are some daft amendments in there, such as closing 10% of Scottish waters, with no justification or scientific backing whatsoever, and we hope Scotland's MEPs and other MEPs will vote these daft regulations out, and I ask all parties in this chamber to lobby your MEPs. Have I got time? Apologies, I'm running out of time to take your intervention. There are many other issues facing Scotland's fishing community at this time. We want to make discards history. There's a lot of really good work taking place. We have to market Scottish seafood a lot better. We're working with Seafood Scotland, the Seafood Association and other bodies to achieve that and to protect the interests of fish processors in Scotland. Claire Baker asked in her amendment about quota management and what's been agreed between the UK Government and Scotland. Well, at long last, we have a step forward in that Scotland will now have some ability, we've been arguing for this for many, many years, to control how quota is allocated to our fishing vessels. Our key interest there is to make sure we protect ownership in Scotland of our fishing rights and that future generations of fishermen have access to those fishing rights. That is really important for the future of Scotland's fishing communities. As I wind up, I just want to refer to the remarks of the mackerel dispute. I have said time and time again that the behaviour of Iceland and Faroes is absolutely outrageous and must not be rewarded, and we will resist any attempt by the European Commission to reward irresponsible behaviour. So finally, Presiding Officer, this month's end-of-year negotiations will, as usual, present us with significant challenges. Our top priorities are clear. We will seek a freeze in the cod plan's annual effort cuts, and we want a mechanism to deliver a rollover of North Sea cod quota. There is much to play for. We will strive to gain the maximum for Scotland so our fishers are given the very best possible platform for making 2013 a successful year. When I go into these end-of-year negotiations, I have a great weight on my shoulders. I will do my best to deliver success, not for Brussels lawyers next week, but for Scotland's fishing communities at these vital talks for Scotland.
That concludes the debate on the annual EU fisheries negotiations. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 5174 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5174.
In moving, Presiding Officer, I would like to notify members it's the Government's intention to have a ministerial statement on Remploy next Tuesday, and I will seek Parliament's agreement to that tomorrow.
No member is asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 5174 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 5175 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a stage 1 timetable for the Land and Buildings Transaction Tax Scotland Bill. I'd ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5175.
Formally moved.
No member is asked to speak against the motion, therefore I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 5175 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 5176 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a stage 1 timetable for the Post-16 Education Scotland Bill. I'd ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5176.
Formally moved.
No member is asked to speak against the motion. I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 5176 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 5194 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a revision to business programme for tomorrow, Thursday the 13th of December. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5194.
Formally moved.
No member is asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 5194 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of 2 Parliamentary Bureau motions. I'd ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motions number 5177 and 5195 on committee membership.
Moved en bloc.
The question on these motions will be put at decision time. There are 6 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that amendment number 5172.2 in the name of Claire Baker, which seeks to amend motion number 5172 in the name of Richard Lockhead on the annual EU fisheries negotiations be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5172.3 in the name of Jamie McGrigor, which seeks to amend motion number 5172 in the name of Richard Lockhead on the annual EU fisheries negotiations be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is amendment number 5172.1 in the name of Tavish Scott, which seeks to amend motion number 5172 in the name of Richard Lockhead on the annual EU fisheries negotiations be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5172, in the name of Richard Lockhead, as amended many times, on the annual EU fisheries negotiations be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5177, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, on committee membership be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5195, in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick, on committee membership be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The membership is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should do so quickly and quietly.